Chapter 1460. This young man who only had 5 or 6 retainers with him was the crown prince of Yanqi, Zhao Zhu. Compared to Wu Zhongshuan and his men who were clad in metal armor, Zhao Zhu was dressed in a brocade robe. If it were not for the common saber on his waist, he would be easily mistaken for a young master who was out traveling. Beside him were 2 personal bodyguards from the crown prince's mansion, as well as a few outsiders from the southern border, 1 man and 2 women. The man's attire was extremely strange. He had a monk's ring scar on his bald head, but he wore a Taoist robe. The slightly older woman was extremely beautiful. She looked like a beautiful woman in her early 30s. If it wasn't for the fact that her aura was extremely strong and intimidating, she would have died young in this chaotic world of war and on the banks of the Guangling River where the smoke of war was rising from all directions. The younger woman was tall and was clearly a woman from the northern lands. Her appearance was not that stunning, but she had a unique style. Tang He, Li Chunyu, and the other generals had long heard of the half-monk, half-Taoist man and the woman who had appeared on the Rouge list 3 times. Gong Bonk, the disciple of Wang Xinji of the martial emperor city, and Linya, the great grandmaster of fist arts, were well-known figures in Jianghu. As for why these 2 people had attached themselves to His Royal Highness, they were too lazy to think about it. No matter what conflict Crown Prince Zhao Zhu had with their benefactor, Wu Zhongshuan, the vast southern border would be filled with heartfelt admiration. His Royal Highness had joined the army at a young age and had killed almost 10 people in the land of the Berserk miasma. He had built countless fortresses of various sizes. Before the rise of the young man surnamed Su in Bailiang, the people of the southern border were incomparably proud. They liked to say to outsiders that they had produced the crown prince of the crown prince who was most proficient in both the pen and the sword. Zhao Zhu smiled brightly and returned a fist salute. "Thank you for your hard work, General." Wu Zhongshuan's mouth twitched. This was probably considered a smile. Zhao Zhu turned his head to look at the river and asked softly, "What is the movement between Zhao Sun and Zhao Yi?" Zhao Zhu was, after all, the commander-in-chief of the northern expedition in name. Wu Zhongshuan was only the deputy commander-in-chief, assisting His Royal Highness, who had disappointed Li Yang greatly. Wu Zhongshuan said in a low voice, "The Qingzhou Navy went east along the river. At the Wubua Lake Pass, Longdu, and the west of Bailu Lake Zhuji, to block the return route. Furthermore, the Qingzhou Navy's division of the Navy is Zhao Sun. Qingzhou is definitely an expert who is guiding Zhao. As for Zhao Yi's half of the Guangling Navy, on the vast Bailu Lake, the large warships are more powerful. Now that the ships are in formation, they are like cavalry on land. Chao Changqing's West Chu Navy has few soldiers and small ships to begin with. Encountering such a formation, not only is it difficult to attack from the front and difficult to attack from the back, even their original advantage of being small and nimble has disappeared." Zhao Zhu nodded and seemed to ask casually, "In the late spring, what is the weather like at Bailu Lake? What is the wind direction?" Wu Zhongshuan was stunned. Not only was this old general who had never personally participated in a large naval battle, the other generals were also stumped. Linya, the female Wu Dao grandmaster who once carried a cauldron to smash the slow-moving sword that entered the city at Xianxia Valley, smiled and said, "The strategists of the Spring Snow House who have been living by the Guangling River all year round aren't all good-for-nothings." Zhao Zhu sighed and said, "Then now it all depends on whether Chao Changqing can turn the tide with his strength alone." Gong Bonk rubbed his bald head. "It will be difficult. The best swordsman in the capital, Qi Jiajie, has arrived. Chai Qingshan of the Dongyue sword pool will also not be absent. It is said that the woman surnamed Xianyuan from Mount Hui will also help. In addition to Zhao Go, who has turned out in full force, killing Chao Changqing is out of the question. But if we talk about blocking a few of them, it will not be difficult." Wu Zhongshuan's cavalry unit bid farewell and left. Zhao Zhu remained on the riverbank for a long time. He shook his head and lowered his head to look. The saber at his waist was tied with a thin string to a worn-out money pouch. His Royal Highness muttered to himself, "If there is a day when the country belongs to me, Zhao Zhu, and the Jianghu belongs to you, Su Fengyan, Then it will not be in vain that we two brothers met at Dantong Pass. He reached out and grabbed the cloth pouch that he had sewn and mended many times. He gritted his teeth and said in a low voice, "The one surnamed Su, no matter what difficulties you encounter, don't die. You are the only brother I will recognize in my life. Don't try to be a hero. If worst comes to worst, you can come to my place. You have to know that the little beggar who was so poor that his pocket could not even make a sound is now richer than anyone else." The northern barbarians saw beautiful silk, but they did not believe that it was made from silk spun by insects. The scholars of the Central Plains did not believe that there were yurts in the grasslands that could accommodate 1,000 people. The people of the world did not go to Guangling River, but they did not believe that there were large boats on the river that could accommodate 20,000 people. In the middle of Bailu Lake, a majestic ship that was 30 to 40 feet above the water's surface sailed alone on the lake. Looking at the direction of the ship's bow, it was heading toward the West Chu Navy. A large flag with the character Jiang flapped in the wind. A beautiful woman with a purple sword case on her back stood on the railing of the third floor. Her clothes fluttered in the wind, making her look like a fairy. The surface of the lake was vast. Suddenly, a small boat appeared in the distance. It got closer and closer until it was a few hundred feet away from the ship. A woman in white sat at the bow of the boat. A red string was tied around her wrist and a wine pot was hanging. Behind her stood a person in a red robe with large sleeves. The woman with the sword on her back and the woman in white looked at each other at almost the same time. It was just a glance and they did not look at each other anymore. The world did not know that this meeting had been separated by a full 800 years. The woman in white Luo Yang retracted her gaze. She raised her head and drank a mouthful of wine. She smiled lazily and said, "After so many years, I still find it annoying." On the other side, Jiang and I reached out and pressed down on the sword case. Only then did the sword in the case stop crying. In the big city of the west regions that stood thousands of miles above the yellow sand. When the sword was about to leave the city, the short man with a wooden face and long arms like an ape no longer suppressed the shockingly abundant qi in his body. His body suddenly expanded, and only then did he return to his normal stature. The long sword rushed forward in a line. He reached out his palm and hit the tip of the first sword. He twisted his wrist. The thousands of flying swords, in the line all flew in a circle. After the long sword that pierced through the thick city wall spun for a while, it blasted a hole as big as a basket on the city wall. In the next moment, Tuoba Bodhisattva, who was charging forward, slammed his palm on the city wall. The whole city was in an uproar as if there was an earthquake. The 160 swords that went out of the city to welcome the guest were all shattered inch by inch. The 70 swords that were still connected with qi in the city were also shattered by Tuoba Bodhisattva's palm. Walking on the lonely street in the city, Su Fengyan waved his sleeve. The long sword changed into a thunder whip that was used by immortals to suppress otherworldly items. Purple lightning lingered around the long whip. The long whip fiercely slashed on the inner city wall. The qi knife cut through the wall like tofu and shot toward Tuoba Bodhisattva. The #1 martial artist in Beimang, who rarely fought for many years, strode forward and directly broke through the city wall. After entering the city, he grabbed the upstanding qi that looked like a long whip but was actually the essence of the sword will and tore it apart. His other hand slapped out casually. The broken pieces of the city wall that didn't have time to fall to the ground disappeared in a flash. Su Fengyan put two fingers together and gently drew. The long whip with purple qi that didn't weaken at all quickly bent and retracted. It smashed the huge rock that broke through the air. Under the whip, a bottomless ravine was torn out on the street. In the next moment, Tuoba Bodhisattva's left foot stepped on the tip of the sword. The whole sword began to shake. Su Fengyan whispered, "Disperse." The remaining 700 flying swords seemed to have understood human nature. They acted on their own and danced wildly. After the movement, there was silence. The 700 flying swords stopped in the air and formed a semicircular formation. The 700 flying swords pointed directly at Tuoba Bodhisattva on the ground. This stop was just a moment. The rain of swords fell rapidly. It was like a rainstorm falling from the sky. The violent crackling sounds were like raindrops the size of soybeans hitting the surface of an oil paper umbrella. Dust flew up on the street. Su Fengnian kicked Tuoba Bodhisattva's chest, telling him to leave the city from where he entered. However, Tuoba Bodhisattva rushed into the city again at a speed that was countless times faster than when he left the city. He punched Su Fengnian's right elbow that he raised to block. Then Su Fengnian's right fist and Tuoba Bodhisattva's left fist collided at the same time. Both of them only took 2 steps back. However, the tall buildings on their left and right had all collapsed. The streets near their feet were filled with swords that had fallen to the ground. Some were straight and some were slanted. After Tuoba Bodhisattva and Su Fengnian's fist collided again, they both took a step back and frowned, because he realized that the 500 flying swords had sunk into the ground at the same time and disappeared. Ever since Su Fengnian started practicing saber martial arts, he had traveled through 2 jianghu. In these years, when he fought with his enemies to the death, he mostly borrowed other people's moves and rarely created his own moves. Today, Su Fengnian not only wanted to gamble on victory and defeat, he also wanted to use this opportunity to return to the peak of another realm at the same height. Previously, there was a sword in the world. After that, there was a sword on the ground. After Su Fengnian took 3 steps back, a rolling earth dragon formed by flying swords broke out of the ground and pounced on Tuoba Bodhisattva. His momentum was strong, his strength was great, and his chi was long. It was not something that the one-line sword that had left the city could compare to. Tuoba Bodhisattva was actually forced out of the city. After this sword, Su Fengnian's state of mind also improved a little. He walked out of the city in a carefree manner. It was a pity that no one saw him. If the arrogant old man with the sheepskin fur coat was still alive, he would also cheer and applaud. If old Huang was still alive, he would definitely grin and give him a thumbs up with his missing front teeth. If some wanderer who had traveled the Jianghu with Su Fengnian with a wooden sword could also see this, he would most likely say some words of dissatisfaction, but in his heart, he would be happier than anyone else. Su Fengnian looked into the distance. It was as if he was looking at the Jianghu. This Jianghu where there was only him and was somewhat lonely. Chapter 1461. Tuoba Bodhisattva was knocked out of the city by the rolling sword of the earth dragon. Su Fengnian was also knocked out of the city and temporarily took the initiative. It was like a Liangmang battle where Tuoba Bodhisattva attacked the city while Su Fengnian defended the city. In the end, Su Fengnian still forgot to bring 2 pots of wine. There were more than 1,000 swords in the city. After knocking Tuoba Bodhisattva out of the city again, there were only about 100 swords left. They formed 2 parallel circles around Su Fengnian like 2 snakes biting each other's tails. If Tuoba Bodhisattva wanted to get close to Su Fengnian, he would have to cross these 2 moats. After Tuoba Bodhisattva stood still, he was not in a hurry to get back at him. His gaze followed the 2 sword circles as he patted the dust off his chest. After a while, Tuoba Bodhisattva stepped forward. At the same time, the sword river that was as tall as Su Fengnian's waist expanded. However, Su Fengnian looked above his head. The second sword river that was at the same height as his chest tilted and blocked in front of Su Fengnian. The next moment, Tuoba Bodhisattva's figure appeared above Su Fengnian's head. He opened his 5 fingers and accurately grasped the key sword that was the eye of the formation in the torrent of sword aura. When the long river of sword formation was slightly stagnant, Tuoba Bodhisattva took the opportunity to stab down. Su Fengnian had one hand behind his back and the other hand in front of him gently shook his sleeve. More than 40 flying swords appeared on the sword bodies like red snakes that were as thin as needles. When Tuoba Bodhisattva broke through the formation and stabbed down with his sword, Su Fengnian gently moved 2 steps to the right and controlled more than 40 flying swords to hover behind Tuoba Bodhisattva. Then he stretched out the hand behind him and dodged the attack. He pressed his palm on Tuoba Bodhisattva's chest, who had not yet landed on the ground, and pushed back with his palm, pushing Tuoba Bodhisattva more than 10 feet away. During this time, Tuoba Bodhisattva's back kept colliding with more than 40 sharp swords. The sound of the flying swords shattering was like a landslide, and the red snakes that coiled around the swords turned into fine powder. Since the beginning of the battle, Su Fengnian, who had the upper hand, did not have the slightest complacency on his face. In his field of vision, the tall man who had been pushed back 3 times in a row still had his clothes intact. It should be known that he had almost used brute force to withstand the one-line sword, the earth sword, and the last push of more than 50 flying swords. This meant that his 3 consecutive sword chi had not broken through the man's gang chi. Of course, Su Fengnian was also far from being at the stage where he was going all out. Both of them seemed to be cautiously and reserved, testing their skills. Since they did not have the confidence to kill in one blow, they would slowly grind it out. It was just that when ordinary martial artists tested each other in the arena, both of them liked to go around in circles and would not punch for a long time. As one of the 4 great grandmasters, Su Fengnian and Tuoba's small test of their skills should be shocking to the world. Bodhisattva Tuoba was still holding onto the sword that belonged to an unknown swordsman in the city. He lowered his head and looked at it. There were red threads circling around the sword. It was the floating sword aura left behind by Su Fengnian. It was also the unique supreme art of the mysterious finger-killing celestial phenomenon from Handiao Temple in Liang. Tuoba slightly increased the strength of his 5 fingers holding the sword. The tiny red snakes parasitized on the sword trembled for a while before disappearing in a puff of smoke in an instant. Tuoba did not break the sword directly. Instead, he gently tossed it back to Su Fengnian. This silent action was extremely conceited. You, Su Fengnian, have crossed paths with the 2 sword gods of Liang, Li Chungang and Dongtai. Now that both sword will and sword art can be said to be one of the best in the world, then you can show it to your heart's content. Tuoba will take it all. Su Fengnian did not make any move. After dispersing the 2 sword rivers, more than 100 swords fell in the distance around the 2 of them. They just happened to be inserted into the ground in a big circle, like a thunder pool. In front of Su Fengnian, only the sword that Tuoba had tossed over was left. It hovered on one side of his shoulder, the tip of the sword pointing directly at Tuoba. Tuoba twitched the corner of his mouth. Finally, you are no longer using chi to control the sword. Is it finally worthy for you to hold the sword with your own hands? What an arrogant attitude. Su Fengnian smiled and raised his arm to hold the sword. However, he did not make any reasonable sword movements. Instead, he had already pulled out the sword when he held it. The sword chi burst forth, and the spirit reached the rainbow. A wisp of sword chi, as thick as a dragon's waist, rushed toward Tuoba's face. The latter opened his 5 fingers and casually patted on the aggressive sword chi. The vigorous sword chi exploded in front of him, and it was incomparably brilliant. In an instant, both of Bodhisattva Tuoba's feet were rooted to the ground. His body tilted to the right as though he was about to fall but didn't. A ray of light and shadow flashed past his heart where he originally stood, and a thunderous boom erupted 1,000 feet away. It turned out that Su Fengnian had tossed out the sword. He was the bow, and the sword was the arrow. At that time, before Su Fengnian rushed to the west of Qingsong City to fight with the sword chi, Lu Gui's army had once used ballistas and huge arrows to block the purple chi from the east. The arrows were said to have the monstrous power of sword immortal. When he was young, he read a poem that said, "It's better to get the form than the momentum, and it's better to get the momentum than the rhythm." Therefore, there was a saying that the spirit could be written with the form to be vivid. Su Fengnian naturally did not reach the realm of Confucian sage. However, after meeting Xinyuan Jingqing, Chao Changqing, and Xie Guaniying, he had long understood a truth. The book not only contained the Yenryu's golden house, but also the celestial state. When Tuoba dodged the arrow, he went to the edge of the thunder pool and quickly pulled out a sword from the ground. He swung his arm and drew a semicircle. Then he threw another sword at Tuoba. The power of the arrow was comparable to the Earth Immortal's sword. Although the momentum and force were slightly inferior, it could not withstand the speed and frequency of Su Fengnian's sword. Regardless of whether the arrow missed or whether Tuoba dodged, Su Fengnian was like a diligent old farmer who was harvesting crops in autumn. He pulled out his sword one by one, drew a semicircle with his arm, and shot out arrows one after another. Su Fengnian knew the root of the problem. This was just a rough immortal's flying sword. It could not be used to take a head from 1,000 miles away. To deal with Tuoba, if he wanted to cause a certain amount of damage, it could not exceed 800 feet. The center of the thunder pool where Tuoba was just within the range of this attack. Since Bodhisattva Tuoba had shown that he was willing to be the target, Su Fengnian did not mind at all to let this guy fail miserably at such an easy task. More than 100 immortals' flying swords were strung together like a string of arrows. As expected, Tuoba did not deliberately leave the thunder pool. After dodging more than 60 Earth Immortals' flying swords, he was probably a little angry. After that, more than 30 flying swords that were as fast as lightning were mostly smashed by his fists. However, the last 2 swords were only smashed by him. Su Fengnian also used up all his arrows in one breath. The 2 people's positions did not change. Su Fengnian still had his back to the city, and Tuoba still faced the city gate. Su Fengnian's right arm that had thrown away the sword trembled slightly, but he did not rub it. It was not that he did not want to, but that he could not. He changed his chi at the same time as Bodhisattva Tuoba. However, although the timing of their chi was exactly the same, Bodhisattva Tuoba was still faster than Su Fengnian by a hair's breadth. The seemingly negligible hair's breadth was often the difference between life and death in a fight between great grandmasters. Chapter 1462. When a martial artist ascended to the celestial state, it was like a giant ladder resonating with heaven and earth. It was also like a river connecting to the sea. Logically speaking, as long as there was a chance to breathe, chi could be continuously absorbed from heaven and earth. This was the real reason why there was a saying in the ancient book, "As long as the saint is alive, the thief will not stop." However, in a battle between celestial state and above, even if there was a chance to breathe and a person's state could transcend the mortal world, he was still a mortal with a 7-foot body. After all, there was a limit to the accumulation of energy in the body. Usually, there would be excess energy to replenish. This was also why Su Fengnian used the secret flying sword technique of the Wu family's sword tomb. He wanted to use his own will to exchange for Tuoba Bodhisattva's chi and physical strength. However, it was a pity that the speed of Tuoba Bodhisattva's first breath was still faster than his. He had created more than 100 fairy swords with the addition of his 4th sword grip. Su Fengnian quickly raised his arm and blocked his forehead with his elbow. The next moment, he was knocked against the city wall. He did not lean against the tall city wall with his back. Instead, he changed his posture in the process of flying. His feet landed on the ground. After touching the wall, he quickly bent to reduce the force. Su Fengnian squatted on the wall. Under his feet was the wall that was cracked like a spider web. Su Fengnian did not retreat. He suddenly straightened his legs and shot towards Tuoba Bodhisattva. Then, Su Fengnian was punched back to the city wall by Tuoba Bodhisattva. His whole body was embedded in the wall. This majestic city in the western regions was like an old man past his prime. In the end, there were thunderstorms and torrential rain above his head without rest. Even though he had weathered many hardships, it was inevitable that his life would be hanging by a thread. Fortunately, the 2 culprits who were the ultimate martial artists of the world finally let it go and left the city. However, this sudden storm had already woken up all the people in the city. Many busybodies who were not afraid of death followed the sound and rushed to the city wall. However, when the boldest group of people tried to climb up the city wall to take a closer look, they were knocked to the ground by an invisible and majestic chi. 4 or 5 people who were not skilled in martial arts and did not have enough internal energy were knocked to the ground. Blood burst out from their bodies and they died on the spot, lying in a pool of blood. As for the rest of the fellows who were lucky enough to survive, they only wished that their parents hadn't given them an extra pair of legs. They didn't even bother to wipe off the scarlet blood that continuously flowed out from their 7 orifices as they fled back into the city. They only wanted to get as far away from the gates of hell as possible. This group of people ran through the night streets with their faces covered in blood like malicious ghosts, scaring the busybodies behind them into quickly dispelling any thoughts of joining in on the fun. Then, these miserable fellows suddenly heard a whistling sound above their heads. Under the strong wind, all of them were lifted off the ground and fell heavily to the ground. It was unknown whether they were dead or alive. It was not easy for ordinary people to watch such a fight between immortals. Even if they wanted to clap their hands and cheer from the other side, it would depend on whether they had the luck to do so. It turned out that after Su Fengnian had sunk into the wall, Tuoba Bodhisattva had completely smashed the thick wall out of it. After Tuoba Bodhisattva entered the city, he slowed down his footsteps. If Bail Yang wanted to guard the city gate for the Central Plains, then obediently lock yourself in the gate. How dare you go out of the city to fight? Did you really think that Bail Yang's million-strong army was weak? Did Su Fengnian really think that I, Tuoba Bodhisattva, had the heart of a bodhisattva? Wang Xianji cared about the survival of the Jianghu, but I, Tuoba Bodhisattva, was never a Jianghu person. Why would I care if Su Fengnian could continue the Jianghu's life? Tuoba Bodhisattva looked into the distance and finally opened his mouth. He asked in a low voice, "The 1,000 swords have been used up. Do you want to continue borrowing swords? Or do you want to change your blade and start again? If you can use Gu Jiantong's Thunder of Mind or Spring and Autumn Saber Armor Qi Lianhua's moves, I don't mind waiting for you for a while to let you take another breath." It was obvious that Tuoba Bodhisattva wanted to use Su Fengnian, who was a great master of the Liang Walin, to challenge the entire Liang Jianghu. That was why he was so patient and took the beating. Su Fengnian stopped at the city gate between the outer city and the inner city. Not only were his sleeves fluttering in the wind and rain, but his entire robe was fluttering in the wind and rain. It seemed to have offset Tuoba Bodhisattva's fist aura and did not hurt his body. Tuoba Bodhisattva's voice was not loud, but the eardrums of everyone in the inner and outer city were vibrating. Every word entered their ears, even if they covered their ears. It was futile. A flash of white light rushed over from Mount Lantua. She happened to hear Tuoba Bodhisattva's words outside the city. It was the six-pearl Bodhisattva. Her face was pale. She did not dare to delay for a moment and only took 2 breaths. At this moment, she suddenly stood still and threw a sword high up in her hand. She wanted to hand it over to the young man who was as bright as a firefly in the night sky of the western region. However, she was already at the end of her rope and could not control the sword after throwing it. She did not throw it to Su Fengnian's side but instead nailed it to the top of the inner city wall behind Su Fengnian with a distorted trajectory. As for the other saber in her hand, she could not throw it out for the time being with a pale face. Su Fengnian turned his head to look at the ancient sword, Loudness, that was forged in the Dafeng dynasty and was lost in thought. For some reason, he thought of the cicadas that he heard in Wutangen when he was young. Later on, he heard the cicadas for the first time when he traveled in Jianghu before he turned 20. There was also the last time he heard the cicadas when he brought wine to the Tide Listening Pavilion when his master, Li Yishan, was still alive. The autumn wind was chilling and the cicadas were mournful on the high branches. The first level, the world thought it was noisy. The second level, the world thought it was sad. The third level, the world sang songs of admiration and loudness for the world. Another day, there was another person who had said something heroic to him under a tree with a grin on his face. If one day you are in Jianghu and hear of a peerless swordsman with the surname Wen, there is no doubt that it is me. Su Fengnian did not take down the famous sword, Loudness. Instead, he laughed loudly and said, "If anyone in the city has a wooden sword, please raise it high." In the city, there was a girl named Sima Tieha who happened to be tidying up the family's storehouse. There were a few narrow wooden swords that she used to practice swordsmanship when she was young. When she heard this somewhat familiar voice, she subconsciously grabbed one of the wooden swords and raised it high. She did not care if that person could hear her and shouted at the top of her lungs, "Here!" The next moment, the wooden sword seemed to have a life of its own. It broke through the roof and flew out of her hand. The dumbfounded girl muttered, "Mother did not lie to me. It really was you." Then the girl was somewhat resentful, "But at that time I really did not look handsome." Su Fengnian held the wooden sword and walked towards Tuoba Bodhisattva. The world is full of melancholy, the world is not happy. What harm is there? I have the pleasure sword. Su Fengnian's face was full of smiles. "Brother, you turned around and left Jianghu. Whether you are willing or not, I will walk a part of it for you." This night, at this moment, the entire city only heard one sentence. "Tuoba Bodhisattva. I, Su Fengnian, have a sword that I learned from the swordsmen of the Central Plains, Wenhua. This sword, please leave the city." They had never heard of some Wenhua. They did not even know about Liang River Lake. However, the king of Bailiang, Su Fengnian, and Beimang's god of war, Tuoba Bodhisattva, these two great names were certainly like thunder in their ears. Then, if Su Fengnian really forced Tuoba Bodhisattva to leave the city with one sword, that swordsman called Wenhua should be quite amazing, right? Chapter 1463. Facing Tuoba Bodhisattva, Su Fengnian held the inconspicuous wooden sword and waved it gently. This was a stance used by many swordsmen in the world. Even a fledgling swordsman who had just held a 3-foot sword for the first time could use it. However, Tuoba Bodhisattva's expression was more serious than when he faced the magnificent 4 swords earlier. Su Fengnian took half a step forward with his left foot, followed by 1 step with his right foot. Then, his left foot took the distance of 2 steps, and his right foot took the distance of 4 steps, and so on. Su Fengnian's steps became bigger and bigger, and the last step was like a long sweep across the sky. This was the same move used by Lu Haoshi, the gatekeeper of Great Peace City, to attack the white-robed Luo Yang. However, the wooden sword was still the same wooden sword. It did not contain any profound sword will, nor did it emit any sword aura. Tuoba Bodhisattva, who did not move, could not help but show a puzzled expression. Of course, he did not think that Su Fengnian was bluffing. This person was still far from being exhausted. Therefore, when Su Fengnian rushed to Tuoba Bodhisattva with the sword in one hand, this was also the first time that Su Fengnian, who played to his strengths and avoided his weaknesses after tonight's battle, took the initiative to engage in close combat. Tuoba Bodhisattva retreating hundreds of feet. His gaze was not on Su Fengnian, but on the simple wooden sword that Su Fengnian held in his hand like a horse dragging a spear. Tuoba Bodhisattva was waiting for Su Fengnian to make a move. When he really raised his sword, there was no perfect move in the world, and Wang Xianxia was no exception. However, Wang Xianxi's strong physique and strong will made him the undisputed #1 person in the world. Wang Xianxia could use a simple punch to defeat all his opponents. It was not because of how brilliant his moves were. Wang Xianxia did not care about fancy moves, it was because he wanted to crush his opponents. Tuoba Bodhisattva did not think that Su Fengnian, who was badly injured, had the ability to do so. Otherwise, he would not have schemed so much after the battle. Tuoba Bodhisattva was confident that as long as Su Fengnian used his sword, he would be able to break it. The only difference was that he would need to spend some effort. Today, in Liang and Beimang, the only sword that could force Tuoba Bodhisattva to avoid was the sword of the peach blossom sword god of sword Dongtai. The sword. Even if Su Fengnian had mastered all kinds of sword moves through a comprehensive study, turning something rotten into something magical and reaching the pinnacle of swordsmanship, he still hadn't completely reached the position where Li Chungang once stood and where Deng Tia stood today. If Su Fengnian had reached the level of Lu Dongxian, the first person in 1,000 years, Tuoba Bodhisattva would not have come to this city to humiliate himself. Tuoba Bodhisattva walked leisurely and allowed Su Fengnian to approach him with his sword. He retreated again and again. However, Tuoba Bodhisattva's bottom line was clear. He would not leave the city. Before the city gate, as long as Su Fengnian did not use his sword, he would not attack. Tuoba Bodhisattva patiently waited for his opponent to reveal what Su Fengnian had up his sleeve. During this time, Tuoba Bodhisattva was still paying attention to the wooden sword. It was not that Tuoba Bodhisattva could not attack immediately after Su Fengnian spoke. However, the more Su Fengnian held the sword, the more he looked like an incompetent swordsman who had just stepped into Jianghu. Tuoba Bodhisattva was naturally more curious. Even after Su Fengnian had taken 16 steps, he still did not sense the slightest Grandmaster's aura from the wooden sword. As a result, Tuoba Bodhisattva could not help but think. Could it be that this sword was just for show from the beginning to the end? Was it just to help the swordsman from the Central Plains named Wenhua become famous in the Western region and spread the word? Or could it be that Su Fengnian was playing some boring trick of having the sword in his hand but not the sword in his heart? The reason why Tuoba Bodhisattva could hold back his temper and not attack was because he wanted to pave the way for the inevitable second battle between himself and Dong Tai in the future. The more Su Fengnian used his sword, the greater Tuoba Bodhisattva's chances of winning. In Beimang, It was an indisputable fact that the way of the sword had withered. How could a loftier sword energy satisfy Tuoba Bodhisattva's appetite? Before leaving the city, Tuoba Bodhisattva still had 2 chances to retreat. However, Su Fengnian still had no intention of using his sword. This made Tuoba Bodhisattva vaguely angry. Could it be that this Su Fengnian relied on a broken wooden sword that did not even have a scabbard to scare him out of the city? Therefore, Tuoba Bodhisattva no longer showed weakness and retreated step by step. The tip of his right foot took root on the ground of the street. With a heavy twist, he crushed the stone floor. His left foot suddenly stepped forward. Before the sole of his foot touched the ground, the entire street in front of Tuoba Bodhisattva collapsed. When his left foot stepped down and his right fist punched out, the buildings and houses on both sides of the main street were like wheat fields blown by a strong wind. Thousands of wheat ears could not bear the heavy burden and all fell in the same direction. This strong wind spread throughout the main street, lifting countless pieces of gravel and rushing towards Su Fengnian. Su Fengnian was like a traveler who was traveling against the wind. Since he could not avoid the wind, he would bite the bullet and pass through it. With every step he took, cracks began to appear on his undamaged robe even though it was covered by countless floating scarlet snakes. His black hair fluttered wildly in the wind, and even one side of his face was instantly cut open by the fist aura, leaving small bloody grooves. Tuoba Bodhisattva's heart trembled. This guy actually wanted to shorten the distance by taking the fist aura head-on just to accumulate power for that sword? In the end, when both sides were only 1 step away from each other, the winner would be decided? Or perhaps his ambition was even greater. All the previous stingy calculations of a small businessman were all a smokescreen. In fact, he had been lying in ambush all along. Did he want this sword to decide life and death? Previously, there were 2 swords that were separated into under the heavens and on the earth. Later, there were the dazzling 100 swords of the earth immortal that were separated into inner and outer distance. Until now, there had been no signs of this still sword. Could it be that he would only stop after deciding life and death? Just as he expected, the wooden sword in Su Fengnian's hand pointed towards the ground. Generally speaking, the truth of the world could not escape the 4 words of neutrality and peace. If it was simplified, it would probably be the doctrine of the mean that Confucianism advocated. Buddhism had no self, Taoism had no action. It was probably the same with different approaches to achieve the same result. However, at this moment, Tuoba Bodhisattva saw the complicated and turbulent will of this wooden sword that was twisted but still did not release any sword aura. Unwillingness, depression, resentment, grief. I feel very unjust in my heart. Su Fengnian casually raised the wooden sword and pointed the sword at Tuoba Bodhisattva. There was no reason to speak of. The man and the sword collided directly with each other in an extremely illogical manner. This wooden sword had the meaning of the Jianghu. Resolute and resolute. It was like a crazy gambler who had taken out his life savings and spent a lot of money to decide victory and defeat with God. Chapter 1464. Many years ago, there was a rich young man who was full of ambition for the first time in Jianghu. Unfortunately, it could not be considered a leisurely journey. He did not meet any fairy with fluttering clothes, nor did he meet any chivalrous heroes. He could only be considered to be at the bottom of Jianghu, which was like a rotten quagmire. Even 3 meals a day were a problem. That Jianghu trip was a complete mess. Then he met a wooden sword ranger who sympathized with him. It could be said that no discord, no concord. When he was stealing melons, he met a fellow traveler. At first, both of them were scared half to death. After that, they became companions. Relying on the knowledge he had accumulated at home in his early years, he always liked to use some of the great principles he had read in books or heard from others to poke at the narrow-minded and shabby ranger. His words seemed to be sincere, but in reality, he mischievously told the guy who always liked to use his clothes to carefully wipe his wooden sword that all the famous swordsmen in the world valued their swords. However, that kind of value, in the final analysis, was because of the sword intent that extended from the 3-foot-long sword in the hand. Which first-class swordsman valued the sword more than the person? If that guy really could not refute, he would only say, That's someone else's sword. It's none of your business. It's not mine. If he was really forced, he would become angry out of humiliation and hold the wooden sword, threatening, "Do you really think that I don't have a few trump cards in Jianghu?" He would often provoke him by saying, "Come at me if you have the ability." In the end, he would definitely be chased by that guy with the wooden sword. He would say things like, "Monkey plucks peach, black tiger plucks heart," and so on. In fact, he was just using the wooden sword to scare people. What really annoyed him was that there were several times when he was squatting on the ground in the wilderness, to his heart's content. That guy would always jump out at the wrong time and say that he wanted to show him a new set of peerless swordsmanship. As long as he did not praise people until his mouth was dry, that bastard who took advantage of people's difficulties would definitely not stop practicing his swordsmanship. That time when they traveled the Jianghu together, in short, it was during the martial arts competition for a spouse. That guy had rushed up to the arena in high spirits and was beaten down dejectedly. After that, not only did he have to carry that guy out of the arena amidst laughter and rolling eyes, he also had to be responsible for being that guy's practice target. Only then could that bastard, who was determined to become the world's #1 swordsman, regain his composure and continue to be in high spirits. Then, he would go to other places to be beaten. That guy had too many small problems. When he met Gu Liang, who fell in love with him at first sight, he always had to pretend to be her study companion. He always had to lie that the scrawny horse was his mount. If he asked the village women for a few bowls of water to quench his thirst, that guy with a smoking throat would not have the consciousness to repay the kindness of a drop of water. On the contrary, he might even burn the bridge after crossing the river. When he risked his body to be taken advantage of by the village women, he would loudly ask if the man in the house was dead. If he was not dead, he would quickly come out to see the wild man stealing his wife. There were several times when they were almost beaten to death by groups of farmers carrying hoes in the village. Every time he was humiliated or tactfully rejected by the woman he liked, that guy would lose his soul and lie on the ground like a corpse. He did not know whether that guy was heartbroken or not. Anyway, as a spectator, he was really tired. 1 or 2 times was fine, but why didn't he learn his lesson after 17 or 18 times? You used king straw rope to hang a wooden sword on your waist. Every time you squatted by the water, you would ask me in Old Huang if I was handsome or not. You would roll your eyes and nod helplessly when you saw us. Do you really think that you are handsome and suave? Those girls with big buttocks and big breasts you met halfway and made you drool had to cry and beg to marry you? In this day and age, young ladies who are slightly more well-off have discerning eyes. Do you think that just because you ride that inferior horse over there, you won't be able to see the miserable scene of your pair of tattered straw sandals exposing the toes of your tattered straw shoes? Those women would be able to tell how many copper coins you had in your pocket with just a quick glance, as if you were wasting money. Later, they met a rich family, a young lady who liked to call herself a heroine. With great difficulty, they were able to live lavishly for a period of time. Finally, they were able to eat proper food in a restaurant. They drank big bowls of wine and ate big chunks of meat. They lamented that their bodies reeked of alcohol and their mouths were greasy meat. This was the kind of life a hero should lead. Later, the girls squandered all the money, and their days began to be tight again. They thought that you would be depressed for a long time, but they did not expect that you would eat the sour dried beans that you stole from the village's grain-drying field. You also said that you tasted the long-lost meat aroma. There was no banquet in the world that lasted forever. First, you said a few words to the girl and gave her half a bag of copper coins that you had secretly saved. After that, you pretended to be a man. That night, you were so distressed that you could not sleep. She teased you and asked you if you wanted to come back. In the end, you angrily picked up the wooden sword and cut it. Finally, you squatted on the ground and sighed bitterly, saying that it was 2 different things. It was one thing to treat the girl as a friend and be willing to give her as much as she had. You generously squandered all your money. It was another thing to feel distressed. It was the same thing to have 2 different feelings. It was not contradictory. In the end, the 2 of them also had to part. That night, sitting on the stone steps of the ruined temple, the nameless wanderer hugged the wooden sword and said that he did not have any savings left. He only had the wooden sword. Even if he was a brother, he could not give the sword away because he would have to rely on it to make a living. He would have to make a name for himself and become one of the best swordsmen in the world. He also vowed that after he made a name for himself, he would definitely return what he owed in the past 2 years. He, Wenhua, did not have the habit of owing people. He joked that there was no need to return it. He did not expect it. The guy who had never gone to private school and had never read books still said the same thing. Brothers should settle accounts clearly. You gave without asking for anything in return, but I, Wenhua, would not really laugh and act as if nothing had happened. They were two different things. That time in the extremely destitute Jianghu, old Huang was not skilled at all. That little girl, Li Yu, dreamed of becoming a heroine even in her dreams. Wenhua, on the other hand, was a half-baked swordsman. However, many years later, Su Fengnian realized that it was like a jar of old wine. After drinking it, the aftertaste would always be there. That Jianghu, which was full of poor and destitute people, was much more memorable than the wonderful Jianghu that Su Fengnian yearned for when he was young. It was the kind of Jianghu where he could leap over roofs and vault over walls and step on snow without leaving a trace. It was a dark and windy night where he could kill people. Tuoba Bodhisattva's expression kept changing. How did Su Fengnian end this sword? Tuoba Bodhisattva snorted coldly and retreated out of the city. He originally wanted to enter the city quickly after Su Fengnian's unreasonable sword's momentum weakened from its peak. He wanted to return the favor on the spot with a thunderous momentum. At that moment, it would truly be a matter of life and death. However, Tuoba Bodhisattva was stunned on the spot. It was not because Su Fengnian had a backup plan. The sword's momentum was still rising steadily. It was the exact opposite. In the end, that sword only had Qi Yun and not the slightest bit of sword energy. Su Fengnian stood still with his sword in his arms. He could not stop laughing. Wenhua, did you see that? Your Jianghu, your wooden sword, easily beat a master like Tuoba Bodhisattva out of the city. Su Fengnian inserted the wooden sword into the ground and raised his arms. The ancient sword, Fang Xing, and the famous blade, Qi Yun, flew from the hands of 6-jewel Bodhisattva in the inner city and the outer city, respectively. He held them gently. Su Fengnian stepped forward. Before he left the city, he turned his head and looked at the wooden sword. He laughed softly, "Next it's mine." The yellow sand of the desert spun for thousands of miles. Chapter 1465. The mountain range that traversed the western region like a giant sword cutting the western world in half had the reputation of being the ancestral mountain. All the dragon veins in the world originated from here. At a steep mountain pass that ran through the north and south of the western region, the mountains on both sides were dozens of meters high and the path was rugged and deep. This mountain gap was an important passage that connected the north and south of the western region. A caravan of merchants walked through it with difficulty, the sound of camel bells ringing. The merchants were dressed in tight-waisted Hu clothes and sturdy leather boots. Mixed in with them were some women who wore hats to cover their faces. They were also tall and strong. There was a rumor in the Central Plains that the western regions liked to order women around like men and men around like livestock. These merchants traveling from the south to the north, regardless of whether they were men or women, all wore machetes at their waists. Some men with outstanding physical strength even hung a unique armor bag near the back of their camel humps. Inside the bag was a rough, refined iron chain armor. When they encountered horse gang bandits, they could use camels to replace horses and fight in armor in case of accidents. Suddenly, the caravan was startled by a series of thunder-like sounds from afar. The caravan stopped abruptly and their faces changed dramatically. They mistakenly thought that they had run into a large group of horse gang who were waiting at the mountain pass. More than 50 people pulled out their machetes at the same time. The strong young man even quickly took out his iron armor from his armor bag and put it on. But in fact, everyone knew that if they really encountered horse gang who could create such a scene, they could only kill a few people with their poor combat strength. However, in the chaotic western region that had been without laws for more than 200 years, as long as there were horses and machetes, there would be people willing to work for them. Before the camels lined up neatly, someone with sharp eyes raised his head and saw a horrifying scene. A figure was running from the high cliff, like an eagle hunting for food on the ground. It fell diagonally and landed in front of everyone. After its feet touched the ground, it walked forward 7 or 8 steps due to inertia. It was only 10 steps away from the camel team. Everyone in the caravan was stunned. Some people swallowed subconsciously. They saw that the guy who fell from the sky had a different appearance from the people of the western region. He was young, handsome, and very clean. The young man carried a long sword in a white scabbard on his back and a machete on his waist. After taking a deep breath with dry lips, he raised his arm and made a gesture of drinking water. Then he asked with a smile in the common language of the western region, "Do you have water?" The camel team was silent, not knowing what to do. On the other hand, a woman wearing a hat took off a sheepskin pouch that still had some water left without hesitation and threw it high into the air to the man who looked like a mountain spirit. The young man with the sword and saber expressed his gratitude and quickly leaped out. After catching the water bag in the air, he looked back and grinned. He stepped on the air and turned his body, crashing into the cliff. Then he bent down slightly and used the momentum to rush forward. He continued to leap over roofs and vault over walls, like when he came. As he ran, he raised the water bag and drank a big gulp of water. After finishing it in one gulp, he casually threw it back, but it happened to land on the head of the woman in the bamboo hat. Just as the woman reached out to catch the water bag, a strong wind suddenly rose in front of the camel caravan. Another person fell from the sky like a falling rock. The strong wind blew and all the camels took a few steps back. The water bag missed the woman and fell lightly on the sand. Without waiting for the crowd to see the person's face clearly, he rose from the ground and disappeared in a flash. Many years later, a rumor about an immortal borrowing water spread throughout the western regions. Hundreds of miles to the south of the mountain range, near dusk, 2 separatist forces that had dominated the southern part of the western regions for many years fought fiercely over a woman whose beauty spread far and wide. Both sides had more than 2,000 horses and fought at the famous Emerald Lake in the western regions. It was said that after a young king of Bailiang became famous, the inferior party hoped to use the beautiful woman in their tribe to exchange for 300 sets of iron armor and 1,000 sets of bows from Bailiang, which was the best in the world, so they could dominate the southern part of the western regions. 700 cavalrymen were dispatched to escort the woman to Bailiang. Then, they were intercepted at the Emerald Lake. After more than 2 hours of fierce fighting, the pursuers found out that the woman had already taken a detour and sneaked to Bailiang. They became angry out of humiliation and swore to kill the cunning tribe until the woman was the only one left. Without a man who could fight on horseback, they would see how they could rise in the desert. Just when the 2 sides were about to charge from horseback to dismount and fight, the whole battlefield was torn into 2 halves by a figure. Suddenly, people and horses were thrown off their feet. The front line that was cut open couldn't distinguish between friend and foe. They looked at each other and then at the same time at the guy who broke into the battlefield. They only saw that the man bent his knees, held the hilt of his sword with one hand and the tip of the sword with the other 2 fingers. The sword was held horizontally across his chest. The long sword was bent in a semicircle in front of him. After the dust settled, the long sword still maintained that strange arc and didn't return to its normal position. Another tall and sturdy figure passed through the gap in the battlefield and fiercely crashed into the sword-wielding man with unparalleled strength. The latter's 2 fingers on the tip of the sword rubbed along the body of the sword. The vigorous strength that refused to disperse after charging at the long sword rolled and condensed in the semicircle. Together with the infusion of his own chi, it finally formed a thunderball with purple lightning lingering around it. With a light flick of his wrist, he held the sword upside down to meet the enemy. The fist-sized purple lightning ball circled around the tip of the sword. When the tall and sturdy figure that seemed to be attached to the bone appeared 50 steps in front of him, the travel-worn but not dejected young swordsman smiled slightly. Instead of retreating, he advanced. Tai was held upside down and thunder was generated in the square inch. This sword had the style of holding the sword upside down that Dong Tai relied on to become famous. It also had the power of Gu Jiantong's square-inch thunder. Tuoba Bodhisattva slapped away the purple lightning that was spinning from the tip of the sword to the hilt. At the same time, he stretched out his hand to press on the hilt to prevent the momentum from increasing. He swept a whip kick towards Su Fengnian's neck. When the sword in Su Fengnian's hand was pushed away without any resistance, Tuoba Bodhisattva knew that this guy was up to something again. However, he did not believe that Su Fengnian, who defended more than he attacked, could set up a deadly trap. The whip kick swept out without any delay. Su Fengnian, who had let go of his sword, raised his elbow to block the powerful whip kick. With Tuoba Bodhisattva as the center, Su Fengnian was driven into a complete circle by the kick before he flew out of the circle. It seemed that Tuoba Bodhisattva had the upper hand. However, when Tuoba Bodhisattva's feet landed on the ground, Su Fengnian, who had already used his left hand to hold the hilt of the sword on his right waist while he was spinning, moved closer and closer. The sword was only half an inch out of its sheath. In that half an inch, it shone brightly. The stunned spectators on the battlefield were blinded by the bright light. They could not stop crying even after they closed their eyes. Su Fengnian held the sword but was not in a hurry to pull it out completely. As he rushed forward, the distance between him and the sword increased by half an inch. The scattered light that was like the sun in the sky also converged. It was like water condensing into ice. Although all these changes were complicated, they happened in the blink of an eye between Su Fengnian's advance and retreat. Tuoba Bodhisattva, who was calm and unruffled, narrowed his eyes and waited for Su Fengnian to pull out his sword after about 10 steps. Was Gu Jiantong's famous square-inch thunder finally coming? As for the purple lightning that was still moving behind him after he slapped it away, Tuoba Bodhisattva did not see it as a threat at all. This was because the speed of the purple lightning's movement was too slow compared to his body's movement. It was too slow. In all the martial arts in the world, as long as one was slower by a hair, it would be useless even if one had the power to topple mountains. Su Fengnian, who was holding the famous Dafeng blade, Qi Yun, closed in on him. Just as Tuoba Bodhisattva expected, he was about 10 steps away from him. However, Tuoba Bodhisattva was wrong about one thing. The square-inch thunder was not released when the sword was pulled out, but when the sword was sheathed again. Between the two of them, there was a sudden clap of thunder. Even if Tuoba Bodhisattva had the physique of a genuine Vajra realm, he did not dare to take the rolling thunder head-on. His palms were facing outwards and he raised them slightly to block most of the force. His body moved sideways with the momentum. Su Fengnian was directly facing the straight line. The sound of the tremors was endless. Hundreds of people on both sides were hit by the strong wind. In an instant, they were uprooted from the ground and fell backward. After Tuoba Bodhisattva avoided the sharp edge, he almost instinctively circulated his chi dynamics 600 miles away to welcome Su Fengnian's true killer move. As expected, Su Fengnian's square-inch thunder was sheathed. The second stroke was a complete unsheathing of the sword. A dazzling white rainbow, like a flood dragon winding across the mountain range, pounced on Tuoba Bodhisattva. Tuoba Bodhisattva's one breath started half an hour ago. His chi was at its strongest. His punch had bent Su Fengnian's soundless sword in front of his chest, knocking Su Fengnian into the battlefield. Although his chi dynamic was inevitably weakened, it was still more than enough to destroy the white rainbow. Tuoba Bodhisattva, who wanted to achieve success with one punch, spared no effort. He bent his arm like a hammer. Not only did he smash the white rainbow, he even smashed the narrow saber. Su Fengnian was trying to exhaust Tuoba Bodhisattva's chi dynamic, waiting for the fleeting gap of breathing. Tuoba Bodhisattva was also waiting for Su Fengnian to exhaust his chi dynamic and take a breath. Therefore, his punch not only exhausted Su Fengnian's chi dynamic, but also forced Su Fengnian to take a breath of fresh chi as he retreated. However, Su Fengnian's response was unexpected. He was not like Tuoba Bodhisattva, who was staking everything. He chose to leave some leeway, allowing Tuoba Bodhisattva's punch to pass through the saber and hit his chest. Su Fengnian's body flew backward in the air like a butterfly. Just as he was about to crash into the ground, the tip of the narrow saber in his hand touched the ground lightly, stirring up a large handful of yellow sand. His body leaned back and his legs stumbled backward, facing Tuoba Bodhisattva. The old chi that had not been released after the previous inhalation dissipated completely. Then, his lips moved slightly and he gently exhaled. To be precise, he was trying to complete the exhalation in one breath. Chapter 1466. Tuoba Bodhisattva sneered. He would not give Su Fengnian the chance to take a breath. Taking advantage of the short gap when Su Fengnian was taking a breath, he took a big step forward and punched with both fists. Although Tuoba Bodhisattva only had 30% of his strength left, if this punch hit, it would be much more effective than Su Fengnian, who took 120% of his strength when he was at his peak. It would be like hitting a snake's weak spot. This guy who was full of tricks would definitely spit out a big bowl of blood. Between heaven and earth, from birth to death, there was one thing that was easily overlooked, and that was breathing. One breath, one breath, one breath, and so on. It was done millions of times when one was awake, and it was done when one was asleep. The breathing technique of Taoism's longevity card was to return to simplicity. It was the most important thing to do in breathing. It was rare for a martial artist in the Vajra realm to kill a Xian finger master from the 3 sections. However, even if it happened, no one would be surprised. This was because the gap between the Vajra finger and Xian finger realms was not much of a gap. The threshold that was really difficult to cross was the celestial state. The reason why Han Diaoxi was so famous in Liang Lake and was known as the first person below the land immortals was because of his Xian finger realm. He could fight and even kill a celestial state guru who breathed with heaven and earth. Tuoba Bodhisattva's eyes were stern. He shouted angrily and forced himself to take a breath. He stood still and his feet sank deep into the ground. His fists, which were originally aimed at Su Fengnian, hit each other and his chi increased sharply. It turned out that in the blink of an eye, Tuoba Bodhisattva was shocked to find that Su Fengnian's long sword, which had left his hand, coincidentally returned to its sheath as if it was pulled by an invisible chi when Su Fengnian stepped back to take a breath. At the same time, this slow, purple thunder that Tuoba Bodhisattva ignored also rushed to his back at a shocking speed. Su Fengnian's mouth was bleeding. He said silently, "Return home." The long sword on his back let out a long whistle in the sheath. It was like the last cry of an autumn cicada, singing to the world. It was like an old man who had left his hometown for many years and only wanted to die in his hometown. More than 1,000 people on the battlefield held their heads and covered their ears. They squatted on the ground, but they still could not reduce the sharp needle-like piercing pain in their eardrums. Behind Tuoba Bodhisattva, there seemed to be a purple golden lotus that was 20 feet tall, blooming with petals. Tuoba Bodhisattva had obviously underestimated the power of the sword returning to its scabbard. He felt as if he had been struck by a bell and had no choice but to take a step forward. His body leaned forward like a hunchback. Only then did he manage to dissipate the force of Tuoba Bodhisattva. Without expression. Bodhisattva. Tuoba Bodhisattva. Blood, blood, blood. Beimeng's god of war. He was not surprised by the new move, nor was he angry because he was at a disadvantage. Along the way, Su Fengnian, who was slightly weaker in terms of Qi and physique, would use 1 or 2 unique skills that could be used by ordinary Wu Dao masters every time he took a breath. He would widen the distance between himself and the enemy so that he could take a breather. Tuoba Bodhisattva always thought that it should be the last surprise, but Su Fengnian was always able to pave the way for him when he was in a desperate situation. Li Chuangong's swordsmanship, Dong Tai's swordsmanship, Jianjiu Huang, Lu Baijie, and Huang Qing's sword moves, Wang Xianji's fists, Hong Shixiang's circle, Lu Haoshi's celestial phenomenon, Han Xingxuan's finger mystery, Wang Zhongluo's finger mystery, scholar's qi, fairy's qi. There was no end, no end. This peak battle between the 4 great masters was a grindstone for each other to sharpen the highest martial arts. In the morning light, a black dot ran along the snow-covered mountain ridge to the peak, like a tiny mustard seed in the vast sea of snow. Carrying his sword and saber, he suddenly stopped. He squatted down and looked higher and farther. He casually grabbed a handful of snow and wiped his cheeks. His palm rubbed the stubble on his chin. After a moment of hesitation, he simply stretched out his hand and took out the spirited saber. Tilting his head, he used the shiny blade to shave his beard. Unlike the first 4 to 5 days of fighting and retreating, The situation between him and Tuoba Bodhisattva had turned around since the battle 2 nights ago. In 1 day and 2 nights, they had fought 6 times. Tuoba Bodhisattva had taken the initiative to retreat 4 times. It was also different from the slow back and forth of the previous battle. Now, one of them would choose to retreat if their attack failed. They did not want to fight a fierce battle but wanted to kill with 1 strike. After the monk in chicken soup gave him the Buddha bowl, Su Fengnian had been waiting for Tuoba Bodhisattva in the western region city like a fool. He wanted to borrow Tuoba Bodhisattva's fierce attacks to forge the sword embryo that he had absorbed. Both Tuoba Bodhisattva and Su Fengnian had gained something, but it was obvious that Su Fengnian was more likely to gain the upper hand after striking. After Su Fengnian's last ambush failed, he had pursued Tuoba Bodhisattva for more than 200 miles until both of them reached the top of this majestic snowy peak. In the battle of life and death, both of them had formed a certain tacit understanding. The one who retreated would not deliberately hide all of his chi activity. He would always leave some traces for the one who pursued to get to the bottom of it. Tuoba Bodhisattva had clearly told Su Fengnian that he would be waiting on this snowy peak. As for when and where he would launch his killing move without warning, it would depend on Su Fengnian's ability and luck. After Su Fengnian finished shaving his beard stubble, he put his knife back into its sheath. Before he stood up, he grabbed a handful of snow and put it into his mouth, letting it slowly melt and flow down his throat. Su Fengnian straightened his back. One hand went to his back to adjust the sword, the other hand pressed on the hilt, and looked up. Suddenly, heavy snow fell. The scale was getting bigger and bigger. It was obvious that Tuoba Bodhisattva had created a huge avalanche with human strength. Su Fengnian was sure that Tuoba Bodhisattva would hide in the heavy snow. He closed his eyes and held the hilt with 4 fingers, his thumb pressed tightly on the hilt of the narrow saber, making the action of pulling the saber out of its sheath. The heavy snow fell from the top of the mountain like a flood, and then split up and passed by Su Fengnian on both sides. Su Fengnian was like a cornerstone, unmoving. Chapter 1467. An ice spear filled with qi was as fast as a rainbow as it pierced towards Su Fengnian's chest. Su Fengnian pushed out the narrow saber from the sheath and brushed past the spear and Tuoba Bodhisattva who was holding it. A piece of flesh was torn off Su Fengnian's shoulder, but a string of scarlet blood was left in the air beside Su Fengnian. Su Fengnian turned around. On the brink of death, there was no lingering fear in his heart. He only felt some regret. If Tuoba Bodhisattva had chosen this moment to decide the victor, Su Fengnian was confident that he could win with a heavy injury that could be temporarily suppressed. He could chop off an arm. However, Tuoba Bodhisattva gave up on this battlefield. He would rather use Su Fengnian's qi to cut a bloody groove on his back. After the avalanche, Su Fengnian sat cross-legged on the ground and panted heavily. He believed that Tuoba Bodhisattva would also be healing at the foot of the mountain. Now, the two of them were no longer fighting over the speed of breathing. They were fighting to end the battle quickly, deciding life and death in one move. Su Fengnian lay lazily in the snow and looked at the sky. He muttered, "Life is as lonely as an avalanche." A large river cut through the canyon and passed through the vast mountain chain that stretched for 3,000 miles. It finally flowed into the sea in Nanzhao. Su Fengnian's forehead was poked by Tuoba Bodhisattva's finger when he was drinking water by the river. He crashed into the bottom of the river. Out of his 10 flying swords, 6 of them were only 1.5 inches away from piercing into Tuoba Bodhisattva's temples, eyes, and heart. Tuoba Bodhisattva punched wildly on the river surface, staring at Su Fengnian who could not jump out of the water. He punched in the river, trying to kill Su Fengnian by suffocating him to death at the bottom of the river. Tuoba Bodhisattva walked on the river surface for a total of 120 miles. In the end, Tuoba Bodhisattva, who forcefully reversed his qi, not only had his arms droop down, but also blood flowed from his ears, nose, and mouth. When Su Fengnian floated out of the water like a corpse, Tuoba Bodhisattva, who could no longer move his arms, could only step on him. Tuoba Bodhisattva knew that he would step on a flying sword controlled by Su Fengnian and his foot would be pierced by the flying sword, but he did not hesitate. Su Fengnian was stepped on in the chest and was once again stepped into the mud at the bottom of the river. For some reason, Tuoba Bodhisattva could not find Su Fengnian's corpse, nor could he find Su Fengnian's remaining aura. This young vassal king seemed to have evaporated from the human world. Just as Tuoba Bodhisattva, who had searched along the river for an entire night to no avail, was planning to return to the Liangmang border at dawn, Tuoba Bodhisattva saw the young man who refused to obediently report to the king of hell no matter what. He slowly walking out of the river's the long sword on his back was nowhere to be seen. He bit the scabbard with his mouth and held the sword with both hands. Both of them did not cross the river. Instead, they slowly walked upstream. Su Fengnian was recuperating while Tuoba Bodhisattva was increasing his chances of winning. After nearly a decade of chasing and killing, both sides ran for thousands of miles. In a dark night with heavy rain that was rarely seen in the western region, they finally welcomed the final battle. It was a simple collision, just like the charge of Liang Mang's cavalry. There was nothing fancy about it. Su Fengnian stabbed Tuoba Bodhisattva's abdomen with both hands. Tuoba Bodhisattva punched Su Fengnian's forehead as he retreated. In the end, Su Fengnian first let go of the sword in his hand. Then he held the sword with one hand. Then he pinched the sword with 2 fingers. In the end, he could only push the sword with 1 finger. When Su Fengnian completely let go of the sword, Tuoba Bodhisattva, who had a hole in his abdomen, fell back heavily. Su Fengnian, whose hair was disheveled, fell straight back. Tuoba Bodhisattva lay in the mud. He stretched out a trembling hand. Since he could not hold the hilt, he directly held the blade and pulled it out from his abdomen. He used his other elbow to support himself and sat up with difficulty. Su Fengnian still did not move. Tuoba Bodhisattva felt relieved. He smiled and coughed up blood. He looked at the sword in his hand. What a pity! Tuoba Bodhisattva suddenly raised his head. He was stunned and his face was full of bitterness. A sword suddenly flew over and cut through the rain. It was the release sword. It was only at this moment that Tuoba Bodhisattva realized that the sword that had disappeared was actually waiting for this moment. It was waiting for the crucial moment when he, Tuoba Bodhisattva, seemed to have won. To do this, there had to be no deviation in time and place. In order to set up this trap, that person had to take a huge risk and split his attention to worry about the flying sword that was far away in the sky before he attacked with his sword. Before that, he had to first guide the flying sword and then accurately kill him who was right in front of him. It was said that Li Yang's cat had died in this way. Tuoba Bodhisattva sighed softly. Originally, he only needed half an hour to recover and he could easily get rid of that young man. Tuoba Bodhisattva did not regret it too much. He just felt a little regretful and aggrieved. Was there enough time? There was no time. Who would have thought that there would be a day when Tuoba Bodhisattva placed his hopes on someone else? Tuoba Bodhisattva closed his eyes. Suddenly, an old man with a head full of snow stood in front of Tuoba Bodhisattva. He stretched out a finger and blocked the flying sword. The flying sword that could not take the head seemed to be wailing. It was extremely miserable. Su Fengnian, who was lying in the mud, maintained his last bit of clarity. He roughly guessed the identity of this person. The creator of Beimang's spiderweb, the Shadow Prime Minister Li Mibi. The old man smiled. You have to know that in order to stop Su Yanbing and Tantai Ningjing, this old man had to reach here first. We paid the price of more than 60 masters. In the future, the Beimang Jianghu can no longer be called Jianghu. The old man seemed to be exchanging pleasantries, but his movements did not stop at all. After breaking the flying sword, he went straight to Su Fengnian in the heavy rain and laughed. Su Fengnian, you have lost honorably. Moreover, you only lost to Tianming. Su Xiao most likely won't blame you. At this moment, Su Fengnian only felt a splash of water by his ear. He did not know that a red sandalwood box had landed heavily near him. A young woman who had finally arrived after riding a sword for 6,000 miles did not look at Su Fengnian. She only said in a low voice, "You're not allowed to die." Chapter 1468. In the night, a man and a woman were walking towards a brightly lit city at the border of the western regions. However, the posture of the man and woman was a bit strange. The woman was carrying the man on her back while the man was carrying a purple box. Both the man and the woman's complexion were not good. Their faces were pale and yellow. It was as if they were in the same boat. The woman glanced at the city that was particularly eye-catching in the night and asked coldly, "Is this the sleepless city that you mentioned? Why do we have to come here? If we want to get rid of that old mad dog, there are many other options." The man's mouth twitched. He forced a smile and said, "This city is actually called Snow Lotus City. If we are lucky, there will be something we need in this city." The young woman with a terrible complexion but an outstanding appearance frowned and said, "Snow Lotus? Do you need it to treat your injuries?" There were too many descriptions to describe a woman's beauty. She was so beautiful that she could make the birds alight and beasts fall from the sky, outshine the moon, and put the flowers to shame. She was so beautiful that she could cause the downfall of a nation. However, there was no description that could compare to the weight of these 4 words. Only one person in a generation had this kind of beauty. At this moment, this woman might be worthy of this description. Even if she was not the only one, she was at least one of the 4. In terms of appearance, the woman and the man could be considered a good match. He did not explain further. Instead, he raised his head slightly and looked at the city that was full of music and dancing every night. Just as he was lost in thought, he suddenly felt a pain in his head. It turned out that her head had bumped into his head. He, who had suffered countless unexpected disasters, said angrily, "What now? When I woke up, you were the one who said that you wanted to carry me. I wrapped my arms around your neck and was about to be thrown a few feet away by you. Then I just gently held onto your shoulders and you threw me away. My hands could only shrink in front of my chest. I don't dare to put them anywhere. Do you still think I am being frivolous? Jiang and I. Why don't you just chop off my hands?" Previously, that fellow had inadvertently rubbed against her hair and made her feel itchy. Now, it was this fellow's noisy voice that made her feel irritated. Without hesitation, she tilted her head again, and the 2 heads collided fiercely. It was clearly a move to kill the enemy at the cost of 800. She hatefully said, "I want to chop you up and feed you to the dogs, but even the dogs don't want to eat you." He argued back ungracefully, "You are a dog. Otherwise, how do you know whether a dog will eat you or not?" Snow Lotus City was a small city located outside of the solitary mountain pass. It was located at the border between Nanzhao and Shishu in the western region. This city was famous for its residents who had been harvesting snow lotus flowers for generations. Among the 9 kingdoms of the spring and autumn period, not to mention Nanzhao and Shishu, which were close to the water, even the Liang imperial family, which was ridiculed as the barbarians of the north, would specially add snow lotus flowers as a first-class tribute. Nowadays, the value of snow lotus flowers was almost comparable to the value of gerfalcon in the Liao. The Snow Lotus City was named after the snow lotus. The joys and sorrows of the more than 3,000 local residents revolved around these snow-white plants. Over the past 30 years, these heavenly treasures had become increasingly rare. The appearance of almost every snow lotus would not only cause the Snow Lotus City to suddenly wake up like a dozing old man, causing the whole city to rejoice. Moreover, it would also cause the city to fall into a bloody storm with undercurrents. Find a place to rest? But that would require money, right? But they didn't. The guy said angrily, "Let's not talk about your ability to kill people. I think you are a sword immortal who can fly 1,000 miles with a sword. Even if you don't have enough money, what's wrong with staying in an inn? If anyone dares to ask you for money, you can take a sword and chop their 18 generations of ancestors until they are convinced. That's it. Do you see it? It's the one with the banner, 'You chew in.' If you don't have the face to eat and dash, I will reason with the innkeeper later." She suppressed her anger, but still followed his words and walked into the inn. The first floor was still full of drunkards. As soon as she stepped through the door, everyone turned to look at them. The woman is carrying the man, and the man is carrying the box. The guy behind her added fuel to the fire. "Sit. I want a good room." The shopkeeper was a bitter old man with slanted eyebrows. He was originally lying on the counter with sleepy eyes and yawning. When he saw the young man and woman in ragged clothes but with an extraordinary bearing, he glanced at them and was speechless in his heart. Just the red sandalwood box, which could be said to be a big treasure, was priceless. Why did this kind of people, who were destined to be rich and powerful, settle down in such a small temple? The bodhisattva was too big, and the small temple could not accommodate them. The key point was that it was now a sensitive time when two snow lotuses appeared together. The old shopkeeper silently prayed for Buddha's blessing in his heart. He sighed, squeezed out a smile, and personally walked around the counter to lead them to a secluded room on the 3rd floor. Without the old man's order, the waiter, who was usually lazier than a pig, brought the best tea for them. Squinting at the waiter's dazed eyes, the old man pulled him out of the room with all his strength. After bending over to close the door, he softly scolded, "You little brat's heart is too big. Do you think you can take a few glances at that fairy-like woman as you wish? Work hard, save money, and honestly marry Xiao Mei from the wine shop next door. Then you can be content for the rest of your life." The waiter said with grief and indignation, "I won't lose any weight if I look at her more." The old innkeeper slapped the guy's head. "She won't lose any weight, but it's hard to say if you'll lose any weight, you little bastard. That woman looks weak, but she must be a martial artist." The young man's eyes lit up. "She looks so good and is from Jianghu. She can't be the famous purple bamboo fairy, right? Could it be that the purple bamboo knife is in the box? Hey, isn't it fitting that the purple bamboo knife is in the purple box?" The old innkeeper put his hands behind his back and said with a self-deprecating face, "Don't think about it. Purple Bamboo Fairy has been General Lu's guest for a long time." The young man muttered in a low voice, "Speaking of which, it's strange. Why are there so many fairies and heroines with purple characters in their names now? Last year, Purple Bamboo Fairy and Purple Sword Fairy came to the city to buy snow lotuses, right?" The old innkeeper rolled his eyes and said, "God knows. If you have the ability, why don't you ask these fairies yourself?" Inside the room, she threw the guy onto the bed and put the red sandalwood sword box on the table. She sat on the chair and closed her eyes to rest. First, she rode the sword for thousands of miles from the misty Guangling Road to the desert of the western regions. As soon as her feet touched the ground, she had to experience a life-and-death battle with the old Beimang dog. After that, she had to carry the burden and flee for hundreds of miles. She had no time to rest, which made her body's qi flow extremely chaotic. There was a deep bloody wound on her neck that was so deep that her bones could be seen. She only needed to bandage it. If it wasn't for the fact that the old man named Li Mibi also needed to protect Toba Bodhisattva, she might not have been able to reach this city. Whether it was the old man with the sheepskin fur coat who taught her to practice calligraphy instead of swordsmanship, or Uncle Chow who was waiting for the imperial order, they all clearly explained the difference between the two. When she first met him in the torrential rain, she manipulated the rainwater and mud into several thousand swords, setting up 2 sword formations. Li Mibi still broke the sword formations effortlessly. During their escape, she did everything she could to turn everything into a 3-foot sword, but all along Li Mibi was strolling in the courtyard, following her like a shadow. The man was Su Fengnian who survived the disaster. At this moment, he was lying on the bed and said softly, "Although Li Mibi is only at the finger xian level, his skills are somewhat similar to Cat-Man Han Xianxia. He is invincible in the same level. As for the ordinary celestial level, it is difficult to suppress him. Otherwise, he wouldn't be the ancestor of Beimang's spiderweb spy. However, don't be fooled by how easily he broke the sword formation and showed the style of a master. In fact, your sword formation made the old man tremble with fear. It's just that the old man is thick-skinned and you can't see it. If he didn't puff himself up at his own cost, he would have scared you into only defending and not attacking. If you killed Tuoba Bodhisattva, how would he sneak back to the Beimang Empress?" She sneered and said, "Are you blaming me?" She didn't expect a sharp rebuttal from the guy. Instead, she became even angrier and said angrily, "Someone didn't kill the opponent in one breath and almost had his head taken back to receive a reward. That's really amazing. No wonder he is one of the 4 great masters in the world." If I remember correctly, at that time, the Jianghu people were talking about the new martial emperor after old Monster Wang. Someone paid someone to help talk nonsense in the Jianghu, right? Su Fengnian said weakly, "Please, the person who was almost killed by me at that time wasn't some weakling. He was Tuoba Bodhisattva. If Li Mibi didn't appear to mess things up, I would have swaggered to the Liangmang border and rode out alone. The head of their Beimang military god would be hanging on the tip of my spear, okay? Then the morale of Beimang would have fallen to the bottom. It would be more useful than killing 200,000 of their cavalry at the border. Simply put, 100,000 of our Beiliang people would have died less. Chapter 1469. Jiang and I didn't care about the ifs and interrupted his daydream. She snorted and said, "In the end, you still have to hide here like a stray dog." Su Fengyan laughed and said, "If I'm a stray dog, how much better are you? Wouldn't we be a cheating couple?" For the first time, Jiang and I didn't talk back. She remained silent. Su Fengyan sat up with difficulty and looked at the lights outside the window. Tuoba Bodhisattva will definitely recover faster than me. With Li Mibi, who is good at killing and setting up ambushes, we can only delay and go south. We can only wait for Su Yanbing and Tantai Pingjing to bring people south and force Tuoba Bodhisattva and Li Mibi to give up. I believe that in at most half a day, the two of them will give up and secretly return to northern Mang. This gamble is very risky for both sides. Even if Li Mibi is willing to take Tuoba Bodhisattva and gamble with me, Beimang won't agree. Tuoba Bodhisattva knows the severity of the situation. Jiang and I coldly asked, "When will you be able to walk on the ground?" Su Fengyan smiled bitterly and said, "It will probably take another 2 days. Tuoba Bodhisattva and Li Mibi will probably only need 1 day to follow the tracks to Snow Lotus City. This means that you will probably have to fight again. Of course, this is the worst outcome. If my luck is not so bad, they might already be on their way back to the north." Su Fengyan suddenly looked tired and said helplessly, "But my luck doesn't seem to be very good now." Jiang and I frowned and said, "How can you ask people for Snow Lotus with your half-dead appearance?" Su Fengyan laughed and said, "Don't tell me you think that there is no place for Beiliang to hide our strength in Snow Lotus City?" Jiang and I couldn't help but turn around and ask, "Is this inn run by a spy from Beiliang?" Su Fengyan joked, "Do you think it will be so shabby?" Jiang and I, who hated being led by the nose by this guy, glared at him. Su Fengyan leaned against the bed and said with a smile, "Can I trouble you to ask the old innkeeper for supper?" Jiang and I hesitated for a moment, but still went downstairs to ask for a portion of food from the unlucky old man with the slanted eyebrows. Then, she asked for an extra room on the 3rd floor. Since the inn didn't ask for any money from them from the start to the end, she felt at ease and acted extravagantly. Su Fengyan only saw the old innkeeper enter the room with the food box, but did not see her figure. She let out a sigh of relief and said with a smile, "Innkeeper, don't worry. I won't shortchange you for the accommodation. I don't know if the innkeeper has any connections at the Snow Lotus House. I heard that the Snow Lotus House in Snow Lotus City is a first-class brothel in the southern part of the western regions. Whether you can buy Snow Lotus here depends on fate, but whether you can eat the women of the Snow Lotus House depends on whether you have enough money in your pocket. As for me, I have a little bit of money. I want to take advantage of the fact that we are sleeping in separate rooms and take advantage of this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make a trip to Snow Lotus City worth it." The aged shopkeeper immediately smiled knowingly, but he soon frowned and said cautiously, "To tell you the truth, the inns and restaurants in the city all have these big and small connections. They just think about how to serve the guests well, and how to come and go in high spirits. Since the old man's pleasure dares to use such a name, of course, we have our own methods. However, young master may not know that the girls in the Snow Lotus Tower are very arrogant, just like the concubines in the palace. No matter what status they have, those girls will not go out of the tower to receive guests. However, the girls from the other families are not so particular. This old man can make connections with them and let them come here prettily without anyone noticing. I guarantee that young master won't know about it. Moreover, young master's taste can also be decided in advance. Taking a step back, if young master is afraid that they are not to your taste, this old man can also sell my old face and let them come here more. Young master can choose the ones that you like. Young master, what do you think?" Su Fengyan shook his head and said with a smile, "Forget about the girls of the other alleys. We are eating the signature of the Snow Lotus House. Whether the girls are beautiful or not is not the most important thing. When we go back, we can brag about it to our brothers. Otherwise, we can eat anywhere. Can the girls of Snow Lotus City really be more beautiful than the courtesans of the Central Plains? Innkeeper, don't you think this makes sense? How about this? Shopkeeper, I used to have a friend who was a regular customer of the Snow Lotus house. He spent thousands of taels of silver there. You go to the brothel keeper of the Snow Lotus house and tell her that there is a friend of young Master Su in Fushui Prefecture who wants to have a drink with the courtesans in the house. Let them pay the price. As long as they dare to bid, I will dare to bid. Innkeeper, as long as you pass the message, no matter whether the deal is successful or not, when we check out and settle the bill, I will add the extra carriage fee. When the old innkeeper heard this, he was overjoyed and ran to pull the strings. Not long after, Su Fengnian saw the door open. She stood there with a fake smile. Without waiting for him to explain anything, she slammed the door and left. Less than an hour later, the door was gently knocked. Su Fengnian said calmly, "Come in." Two women walked into the room and deliberately changed into ordinary clothes. However, when they took off the veil that covered their faces, one of them was a middle-aged woman and the other was in the prime of her youth. Both of them were outstanding women who had their own romantic styles flowing from head to toe. After seeing Su Fengnian's appearance, the young woman's eyes were filled with curiosity and scrutiny. The plump woman, who had been trembling with fear along the way, was so scared that she directly dropped to her knees. She didn't dare to say anything and didn't even dare to breathe heavily. Su Fengnian said softly, "Mrs. Song, please get up. Sit down and talk." Even Lucio, who is known as a heartless and unscrupulous person in Liyang, secretly respects Mrs. Song. The woman's eyes were red. After getting up, she curtsied and sat down. Su Fengnian asked with a smile, "Is this the next courtesan Yu Qingling of Snow Lotus House?" The woman, who had already recognized Su Fengnian, nodded and replied respectfully, "Yu Qingling is an orphan in the Snow Lotus City. She entered the Snow Lotus House since she was a child. She is my confidant. However, for the sake of caution, she was only registered in the third-class room of the Whispering Room 4 years ago. Last year, she made a small contribution and was promoted to the second-class room this spring. Currently, she is in charge of keeping an eye on the number 1 local snake, Lu Huaishi. This person is nicknamed General Lu. He was born and raised in Snow Lotus House. He has more than 1,000 men under his command and is also very influential in Nanzhao. Among them, several familiar forces are deeply grateful to Lu Huaishi. I suspect that Lu Huaishi was first supported by Zhao Go of Liyang. However, 3 of Zhao Go's spies died one after another in autumn and winter last year. Whether Lu Huaishi has been instigated by Beimeng or Shishu, we need Yu Qingling to find clues. If Yu Qingling can recruit people for Fu Shui House, she will be worthy of her status as a second-class room. Su Fengnian smiled and said, Lu Huaishi was able to move between several major forces and constantly grow his strength. First, he stood out from the crowd. After he gained a firm foothold, he became a feudal lord in the southern part of the western regions at the age of 35. Such a bold and ruthless person naturally has a lot of charisma. According to the spy report, even the daughter of Nanzhao's royal prince Liyang was willing to be his woman behind the scenes and didn't hesitate to elope for him. The woman looked at the woman who was standing there in a daze and didn't know what to do. She smiled gently and said, "It's best if a sheep enters the tiger's mouth and can retreat after success. It wouldn't be strange even if there are no bones left. However, if you help the tiger do evil, you deserve to die." Since Yu Qingling has joined the Whispering Room, she can distinguish between public and private matters. Her next sentence fully displayed Madame Song's iron-blooded demeanor as a top spy. "If there is a mistake, this servant will clean up the house myself without the need for the Whispering Room's instructions. This servant will also ask head shopkeeper Chu for punishment if I don't know how to use people." Yu Qingling bit her lips and stood there elegantly, which made her look even more pitiful. Su Fengnian didn't comment. He looked at the beautiful woman who was well known in Snow Lotus City and said, "Yu Qingling, what kind of person do you think Lu Huaishi is? Tell me the truth." She still couldn't guess who this young master was. However, since Madame Song, who had the nickname of Empress Dowager in Snow Lotus House, was so serious about this matter and didn't hesitate to humiliate herself to the point of calling herself this servant. Yu Qingling believed that this young master must be an important person of the Whispering Room who had come to Snow Lotus City. Although she was nervous, she carefully chose her words and replied, "He is cruel and merciless, but he is affectionate and loyal." Su Fengnian smiled and dismissed it. Is there any ready-made Snow Lotus in Snow Lotus City recently? Chapter 1470. The woman said, "What a coincidence. Not only is there one, but there are two of them. One was found by Lu Huaishi's mansion and the other was found by the young man in the city from his father's last words. He waited for 6 years and went to the Snow Mountain 4 times to check on the lotus bud. After much effort, he finally found it this year. The former was waiting for a good price. It was rumored that Lu Huaishi's original intention was to give the Snow Lotus to the Commandery Prince of Nanzhao as an apology to his father-in-law. Later, it seemed that the Weaving Bureau of Shishu and Nanjiang wanted to buy it and give it to the current empress. However, there was also a top master from the Central Plains who had been waiting for many years. He said that he was willing to sell his life for Lu Huaishi in exchange for the Snow Lotus. It seemed that he wanted to cure a woman's illness. After the young man brought the Snow Lotus and carried an old man who lost his legs back to the city, the various forces started a new round of competition. After all, the Snow Lotus was too rare. It was sold at a high price of 30,000 taels of silver 30 years ago. Now it was even more priceless. Even 100,000 taels of silver might not be enough to buy it. However, the ignorant young man was stubborn. He said that he did not want to sell his Snow Lotus and only wanted to give it to a girl from Ma family fort. The girl was the daughter of the Ma family fort's fort master. Her father had already arranged a marriage between the two families. Perhaps she had some interaction with the young man, which made the young man so stubborn that he was willing to risk his life for the Snow Lotus. Right now, the young man and the Snow Lotus stored in the ice cellar are blocked at the door by that Central Plains master. The two of them must have reached some kind of agreement. Without the protection of that Grand Master of Swordsmanship, the young man's corpse would have been long gone. Song Fu lowered his voice and asked, "Do you need the Snow Lotus house to fight for the 2 Snow Lotuses?" Su Fengnian waved his hand and said, "There's no need for the Snow Lotus house to get involved. Just tell me the exact location of the 2 Snow Lotuses." Madame Song's eyes were burning with determination. She said in a low voice, "Since the Fushui house set up the Snow Lotus house in this city, is it just for show? How many people have died at the border between Liang and you? Even if the Snow Lotus house is wiped out, how many people can die?" Su Fengnian smiled and said, "Madame Song said that the Snow Lotus house is fair. I should do the same." Madame Song shook her head. "It's not the same." Su Fengnian looked at the woman who seemed ready to die at any moment and said calmly, "I have the final say." Mrs. Song was stunned. Su Fengnian glanced at the door, coughed, and said to Madame Song, "I'll have to trouble Madame Song to ask the inn to prepare a carriage for me. I need to immediately go to the lotus-picking youth's place. Madame Song, you can just give the coachman directions. All right, give the innkeeper more money. If I need anything in the future, I will definitely look for your Snow Lotus house. If not, don't act on your own accord. Just treat it as the rules of the water room." The 2 carriages parted ways outside the inn. Madame Song sat in the carriage with an expressionless face. Yu Qingling, who was about to go to General Lu's residence to feed the tiger with her body, mustered up her courage to ask something. Madame Song, with her eyes closed, said coldly, "Don't ask what you shouldn't ask." In the other carriage, Su Fengnian sat leaning against the wall. Jiang and I sat upright with his back against the red sandalwood sword box. His expression was uncertain. After 7 or 8 turns, the carriage came to a narrow and dark alley. The simple and honest coachman stopped the carriage, lifted the curtain and said apologetically, "Young master, young miss, the alley is too small for the carriage to enter. You will have to walk 34 steps forward." Jiang and I got off the carriage first and said, "Walk by yourself using the wall." Su Fengnian had a bitter smile on his face. With the help of the coachman, he got off the carriage and told the coachman not to wait for them to return to the inn first. He really had to use the wall to walk. He was in a sorry state. Jiang Ni's steps were not big. She walked slowly less than 6 steps in front of them. She did not forget to sneer. If you go to that Snow Lotus house to spend the night, won't you be unable to walk by yourself tomorrow? That was not all. She added, forget about the girls in the other alleys, we'll be eating the signature dishes of the Snow Lotus house. TSK, you're indeed a hedonistic son of a wealthy family. These words sound like something only a veteran in the field of flowers could say. Su Fengnian laughed angrily. Eavesdropping on other people's conversation makes you sound so righteous? Jiang and I snorted, my ears are sharp. Otherwise, do you think I'm happy to hear such filthy words? The two came to a dilapidated yellow mud house without a wall. Jiang and I carried the red sandalwood sword box and stood with her arms crossed in front of her chest. Su Fengnian had to put one hand on her shoulder to stabilize himself. However, she dodged, so Su Fengnian had to bend over with his hands on his knees. A middle-aged man with a sword on his knees was sitting on the stairs in front of the house. He should be the swordsman from the Central Plains who was known as a grandmaster of martial arts in the eyes of Snow Lotus City. Su Fengnian did not know this person. It seemed that this person, who had stayed in Snow Lotus City for 4 or 5 years, did not recognize him and Jiang and I. As for those guys lurking in the darkness, Su Fengnian knew that a skinny camel was still bigger than a horse. Although he was weak and could be blown away by the wind, he could sense clearly with his will of divine. Although he could not defeat Li Mixi and Tuoba Bodhisattva, he could kill them all without lifting a finger. Moreover, he had Jiang and I by his side. As long as it was not the 14 people of Wu Ping or the great grandmaster who was only one step away from getting involved, it would not be a problem. The swordsman looked straight ahead and said indifferently, I don't care about Lu Huaishi's Snow Lotus, but I have already reserved the one in the house. You can leave now. If you don't want to give up, you can ask my sword. Su Fengnian gasped for breath and raised his head to stare at the middle-aged swordsman who had the demeanor of a master. He asked with a smile, if I may be so bold as to ask, do you have a famous nickname? The swordsman did not answer. Instead, a hearty and loud voice came from the house. What *T hero? This old man was defeated by Dong Yuanrui of Dongyue in the past. He could be defeated with one hand. Jiang Hu is getting more and more ridiculous today. How can this kind of trash be considered a person with a broken sword? This old man's generation was really full of heroes. Let's not talk about others. Let's talk about those who fought with this old man. There was the overlord of Cold Land, Wang Xiu, who used a spear, and the green-robed ancestor of Fengdu. They could barely be considered masters. When this old man fought with them, it was just a warm-up. Only the swordsman with the surname Li was this old man's fated enemy. However, they appreciated each other. However, a young voice in the house interrupted the old man's irrelevant boasting. All right. I carried you out of the cave in the snow-capped mountain. A real man does not boast about his past achievements. Do you know that? Eat your pancake. Su Fengnian was confused. He turned to look at Jiang and I. The corner of her mouth moved and she said coldly, there is no such person. The old man with the sheepskin fur coat never mentioned him to me. Su Fengnian whispered, his chi is not even at the level of level 2 master now. I think he will barely reach the threshold of level 1 when he is at his peak. However, his chi is even more powerful than old man Li's. Then Su Fengnian saw Jiang and I walking forward and asked, what are you doing? Jiang and I said indifferently, go in and beat him up, so that he won't be boasting without a draft. Su Fengnian did not know whether to laugh or cry. He is already so old. Why can't I have a taste of my mouth? Moreover, he was full of pride. Didn't he still put old man Li at the top of the list? Just based on this point, I want to drink a few bowls of wine with this old senior. Only then did Jiang and I stop, but she suddenly turned her head to look at the corner of the alley. Su Fengnian followed her line of sight and saw a budding young girl leading a jujube red horse. She had a kind of indomitable will that only a newborn calf would have, and she would not care about anything. After the young girl walked into the tiger's den, she looked at Su Fengnian cautiously. When she saw Jiang and I, she smiled. This made Su Fengnian a little depressed. The young girl led the horse and shouted, Hong Shuji, don't be stupid. Quickly find a buyer for that snow lotus. Do you hear me? That's all I have to say. I'm leaving. The young girl's back was facing the house. She tried not to make it too obvious that she was crying. In the future, we will go our separate ways. A sallow and emaciated young man rushed out of the house. His face was full of tears. He wiped his tears with his hand and shouted, "Ma Gong, your father said that as long as I pluck the snow lotus, he will not let you marry that bastard." The young girl turned her head and said angrily, "My father only wants you to die in the snow mountain, you idiot. So what if you pluck the snow lotus?" The young girl raised her hand to cover her face. She sobbed, "We can't be together." The young man also cried, "I don't care. I don't want you to be with me now. Anyway, that guy is not a good person. As long as you don't marry him, it will be fine. I will be very happy." Su Fengyan was still bent over. His expression could not be seen clearly. Then, Jiang and I walked closer and kicked his calf. Su Fengyan asked, "What's wrong?" She widened her eyes and said angrily, "You don't care?" She quickly added fiercely, "If you don't care, I will." Su Fengyan smiled. He put one hand on his back and slowly straightened his back. He smiled brightly, "Let me take a breather first. Care, how can I not care?" Su Fengyan looked at the young man and the young girl. He sighed, "That's great." Chapter 1471. The dilapidated house, the bright moonlight, and the gloomy and cold alley. There was a Wu Dao grandmaster holding a sword, a sad skinny boy, a young girl holding a whip, a sick man gasping for breath, and a beautiful woman carrying a purple box on her back. In the eyes of the sneaky night walkers lying on the roofs, the scene in front of them made them feel less bored after coming here in the middle of the night. The night walkers were divided into several groups, each with their own benefactor. Among them, the ones with the largest numbers and the aura of a battlefield were the elite soldiers from Lu Huaishi's mansion. They also rightfully occupied the two adjacent roofs with the widest view. The weapons hanging from their waists were all sabers, but there were a variety of them. There were Miao Dao with a slender blade that looked like a seedling, and there were also sabers that came from the southern dynasties of Beimang to the western regions. There was even an old cold saber carried by a man in black who looked like a leader. Only those who were familiar with the Bailiang frontier army could tell that it was a cavalry saber with a more prominent curve than a walking saber. As Bailiang became stricter with the control of the sabers and crossbows, the value of these cold sabers spread among the people in the early years also rose. They could easily be sold for a sky-high price of 700 to 800 taels of silver. On Liang Lake, if there was a cold saber hanging from one's waist, as long as it was not the kind of person who could see through it at a glance, people would involuntarily be afraid of it. A guy approached the man in black who carried the cold saber and whispered, "Leader Qi, the woman below with the purple box on her back is really beautiful. She's even more beautiful than the purple bamboo fairy who came to our mansion as a guest. Why don't we just take action? The whole Snow Lotus City is ours. As long as we enter the city, our lives will be in our hands. Leader Qi, didn't the general say that you need a wife? I think this woman is very good. We just discussed that we'll send the Snow Lotus to the general's mansion and tie this woman directly to your mansion. Today, we'll hold a wedding banquet for you and make a scene in the bridal chamber. Then we won't waste our night in the cold." The man in black who had been instigated by his subordinates to become a mountain king subconsciously stroked his scabbard. His rationality overcame his desire. He shook his head and said, "Don't ruin my foster father's great plans." He was the direct subordinate of Lu Huaishi, the Earth Emperor of Snow Lotus City. He had once followed Lu Huaishi in and out of the 100,000 Great Mountains, which was why he was bestowed with this cold saber that Lu Huaishi loved so much. His purpose on this trip was to keep an eye on that Central Plains man who wielded a sword. Lu Huaishi was determined to obtain that snow lotus because he had publicly announced that he would offer it to a woman with the same name in Western Shu. It was said that she was an extremely beautiful woman, but it was a pity that she was an existence that even Lu Huaishi could not afford to offend. The snow lotus obtained by the lotus picker in his residence had another secret use. Because he was one of Lu Huaishi's followers who had followed Lu Huaishi since his youth, he was qualified to come into contact with some of the inside stories. It was said that there were 10 new sects in Liang, and the Dragon Palace of Nanjiang was one of them. The new palace master, Lin Hongyuan, was not only the leader of the Jianghu in Nanjiang, but also had a close relationship with His Royal Highness, Zhao Zhu, the king of Yen. He did not know what his foster father was plotting, but it was definitely not limited to Snow Lotus City. His foster father had secretly revealed his yearning for the Central Plains more than once. Boschilk, that guy seems to be reckless and wants to interfere. What should we do? The dragon moth adopted by Lu Huaishi frowned and squeezed out a word from between his teeth. Wait. The tuberculosis ghost who had come out of nowhere to mess things up called the young boy and girl to the side and muttered to them like a lousy accountant. Sure enough, the young boy's face was full of suspicion, while the young girl with an extraordinary background was not tempted at all. It was one thing for the young boy and girl to have a wide vision, but in the face of a great change, they were still a little wary. Who would believe that a stranger who appeared out of nowhere, who could easily push them down with a single finger, would paint a big picture for them out of thin air? When the dragon moth on the roof stole a glance at the stunning woman, especially when he saw her looking at the scholarly young man, he, who had always thought himself to be hard-hearted, suddenly felt his blood boil. Then he elegantly jumped down. More than a dozen brothers who had depended on each other for many years also did not want to be left behind, and they all landed on the ground one after another. Apart from the 3 archers who stayed on the roof in tacit understanding, the rest of them were all ready to help the dragon moth on the roof. Everyone had a frivolous smile on their faces, and they almost called the woman sister-in-law. Su Fengnian was talking until his mouth was dry. He told the young boy that as long as he had Snow Lotus, he could guarantee that the young girl would not get married. In fact, the young boy was somewhat tempted. However, the young girl who came from a wealthy family outside of Snow Lotus City mercilessly exposed his lie. Su Fengnian said that he could protect them and safely leave Snow Lotus City. She said that he had to fight with the swordsmen from the Central Plains on the steps first, and then they could talk about other things after he won. Su Fengnian said that he could. She then said that there were many experts around General Lu in the city. Her father's Ma family fort also had 100 cavalrymen and 200 archers. Not only did he have to defeat the swordsmen, he also had to go to the general's mansion and fight with the Ma family fort. Su Fengnian was originally afraid that the 2 children would misunderstand his lack of sincerity if he agreed too quickly, so he casually asked how powerful Lu Huaishi was. As a result, the young girl rolled her eyes at him and said that he was actually a Jianghu swindler who wanted to do business without any capital. He just wanted to cheat the Snow Lotus and then quickly run away. Su Fengnian's physical strength was exhausted, so he squatted down. When he raised his head and was about to speak, the young girl looked down on him even more. She, considerately, told Su Fengnian to just lie down and talk. This way, his legs wouldn't hurt and his waist wouldn't hurt. Su Fengnian laughed and said that the real experts in Jianghu didn't fly around and pretend to be masters. They all liked to pretend to be weak and subservient like him. The young girl's mouth was unforgiving. She said that Su Fengnian wasn't pretending to be subservient and was a real subservient. The young boy who had been watching from the side wanted to laugh, but he held back his laughter. He secretly made a face at Su Fengnian, taking pleasure in his misfortune. Su Fengnian laughed and scolded the young boy. She hasn't married into the family yet, but she's already in charge of both internal and external affairs. Aren't you afraid that your husband's authority will be lowered in the future? The young boy, who was simple and honest but wasn't really stupid, chuckled. The young girl flew into a rage. She gripped her horsewhip tightly and pointed it at the guy who was speaking more and more nonsense. Her face was frosty, and she wanted him to get lost. In the end, Su Fengnian's next words made her completely calm down. What's wrong? Now that Hong Shuji is in danger, your conscience is uneasy, and you want me and that beautiful big sister, 2 outsiders, to stay out of this matter, even if it doesn't work out? Girl, aren't you a little too soft-hearted? Lu Huaishi's lackeys were about to fight when the person with the cold blade at his waist raised his hand to stop them. He said softly, "Something's not right." Then, a wild laughter came from inside the house. You bunch of idiots who don't know Buddha when you meet a real Buddha. What the hell are you shouting about? Like a wild horse, A figure broke through the paper-like walls of the mud house and floated out. First, it jumped over the head of the swordsman who didn't move at all. Then, it passed between Su Fengnian and Jiang and I. Finally, it crashed into the ranks of Lu Huaishi's elite soldiers. The Lu family's bodhisattva, who had been fighting for a long time, shouted angrily. He pulled out his blade and held it with both hands. Using his body to push the blade forward, he rushed forward quickly. His steps were not in a straight line, but were unusually complicated and agile. It was a mixture of the Western Shu Xingyi and the Southern Tang Tongbi style. His movements were very clean. The figure that rushed out of the house flashed and brushed past the bodhisattva in the blink of an eye. Not only did he kick the bodhisattva's chest, he also took the blade with his bare hands. The bodhisattva's momentum did not decrease. He rushed straight to the mottled wall of the alley, stabbed the blade into the wall, and flipped over. When the young man who was respectfully called Head Cheese stopped staggering and turned his head to look, he saw an old man whose two calves seemed to have been cut off by a sharp weapon. The old man was sitting on his beloved blade. He looked around complacently and said loudly, "Yo, young man, you have some weight. Unfortunately, you have encountered this old man. Even if I give you 20 years of hard work, it still won't be enough." The domineering old man glanced at the middle-aged swordsman who did not stop him from leaving the house and said indignantly, "This old man has returned to Jianghu this time and waited in this shabby little town for so many days. Other than that blockhead on the stairs who only has a killing sword but not a heart, no one actually took the initiative to burn incense and worship the gods? Do you really want this old man to start a massacre so that you ignorant frogs at the bottom of the well will understand that there is a land immortal in your Snow Lotus City?" The head chi of Snow Lotus City turned his head and spat out a mouthful of blood. His eyes were malicious and cold. He shook his wrist and asked with a smile, "Old immortal, do you really want to be the enemy of the general's residence?" The old man laughed and said, "What bullshit general's residence? A bunch of blind people. If you really annoy this old man, he will kill you all in an instant." At this time, Su Fengnian smiled at Jiang and I, who had quietly walked a few steps closer to him, and said, "Learn from him. Look at how the old senior walks the Jianghu. Let me tell you, in our line of work, if you don't know how to smile evilly, then you are definitely a fledgling of the Jianghu. Similarly, the evil experts in the Jianghu, this kind of laughter is only a beginner's skill. As for the righteous experts, they must have the demeanor of an immortal. After one move, they must stand with their hands behind their back. At night, especially on a moonlit night, it is the best scene. Think about it. If you put on the posture of looking up at the moon, you will have the demeanor of a great master and won't hurt your eyes. But there's a way, and that's to narrow your eyes and remain silent. Don't speak at all. You can't speak big words. Once you do, it'll lower your status. If you don't say anything, it'll make the bystanders, like us, feel that you're unfathomable." Jiang and I said unhappily, "You are so boring." Su Fengnian glared at him and said, "This is the priceless advice that I personally came up with after wandering the Jianghu. If others want to listen to it, I will not sell it to them." The Ma Jiabao's daughter, who was eavesdropping on Su Fengnian's teaching, quickly exposed him. "You are indeed an experienced Jianghu swindler." Chapter 1472. The young man listened with great interest. He felt that these words made a lot of sense. Every time those rich kids in Snow Lotus City flirted with girls on the street, didn't they like that kind of devilish smile? Also, every time they opened their folding fans, they would open them with a crisp sound and close them with a snap. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't learn that kind of smile. Of course, he couldn't afford that kind of fan either. Therefore, the young man was filled with curiosity and asked softly, "Is there anything else?" Su Fengnian proudly snorted and said, "Yes, there is. The knowledge behind this is as deep as the sea. Kid, let me ask you, are there any heroines in Snow Lotus City whose nickname starts with the character Z? They either like to wear purple clothes or wear purple accessories. There must be some, right?" The young man was startled, and his eyes were filled with admiration. He nodded vigorously and said, "Young master, you are amazing. In this year, there were 3 or 4 immortal sisters who were like this." The young girl curled her lips and said, "What's so great about being able to guess this kind of thing? In Snow Lotus City, there are many young heroes who wear white robes and have 2 blades hanging from their waists. Every one of them claims to be someone's closed-door disciple. They either like to lie on the street drunk and look at the moon, climb up the city wall and pretend to be in a daze, or they like to run to the Snow Lotus Pavilion to show off their poetry. My father said that although they are somewhat skilled, they are still far from the top experts in Snow Lotus City. He also said that these young heroes either had their brains kicked by a donkey when they were young, or their brains were clamped by a door when they grew up. He also said that if I see them, I must avoid them. Su Fengnian said earnestly, "Little girl, you don't understand. These young heroes with lofty ambitions are all young and promising. They have a bright future ahead of them. They will definitely become great heroes in the future." The young girl didn't pay any attention to this guy. She fiercely glared at the young man, Hong Shuji, and said, "Immortal sister?" The young man shrunk his neck and had a sudden inspiration. He began to apply what he had just learned and looked up at the moon. After the old man spoke, the tense situation suddenly took a turn for the worse. This old man has heard of some of your master Lu Huaishi's deeds. He is clearly an ambitious person. Send a message to that whatever general's mansion. Tell him that as long as the one surnamed Lu is willing to offer 10 famous swords, 1,000 taels of gold, and a mansion with 100 maidservants, this old man will reluctantly become his chief guest. Even if he faces the top 10 experts in the world in the future, he will have the confidence to challenge them. The young man surnamed Qi, who still had blood on the corner of his mouth, looked uncertain. Finally, he smiled and cupped his fists. "As long as you can take down that eyesore swordsman and let me take the Snow Lotus, I will try my best to introduce you to my foster father." The youth panicked and shouted, "Old man, didn't you say you wanted to take me as your disciple? Didn't you say you would teach me the peerless martial arts that can easily make me the strongest person in the world?" The old man laughed and said, "Silly boy, with your coarse constitution, even if this old man gave you dozens of top-secret manuals, you still wouldn't be able to become an expert. If this old man hadn't said that, would you have helped me break the formation in the cave?" The old man suddenly looked at the sickly young man. "Your aptitude is just SOSO. Do you want to be my disciple?" This old man has made a comeback this time and is destined to be famous. As long as you agree, this old man will let you rise to the top. The old man changed the topic and looked at the young woman with the purple box on her back. She was really stunning. Even when he was unscrupulous in Jianghu, he had never seen such a beautiful woman. If he could use her as a cauldron, he might be able to return to the peak of martial arts. The old man didn't hide his greedy eyes. He smacked his lips and said with a smile, "However, the girl beside you will belong to this old man. Such a first-grade cauldron, if I don't take it, I will be punished. As for you, young man, a girl is nothing. As long as you have the world's first-grade martial arts." Su Fengnian smiled and said, All right. I originally wanted to talk with you a bit. I wanted to hear about the Jianghu that the old man wearing the sheepskin coat was in. You, after all, are a Jianghu senior who fought with Dong Yuanrui of the Dongyue Sword Pond. Although you lost miserably and had your legs chopped off by the 6 caterpillars, it is not easy for you to live to this age. But since you can't accept it, then there is no other way. You should thank me. If it wasn't for me, you would be a corpse now. Jiang and I snorted coldly. Su Fengnian's smile disappeared. Speaking of which, if I'm not wrong, you're that notorious cauldron casting master, right? You're good at using women as cauldrons and using yin to supplement yang to increase your own cultivation. Even the devil sects deer-chasing mountain isn't willing to accept you. Dong Yunrei, 6 caterpillars, tripod casting master, deer mountain. The old man who had struggled to break free from the prison in the snow-capped mountain cave was greatly shocked. Su Fengnian was probably tired from talking so much. He squatted down again and panted lightly. Except for Jiang and I, everyone was dumbfounded. Even the swordsman from the Central Plains turned pale with fright. Because no matter how hard he tried to suppress the sword across his knees, it would automatically fly out of the sheath. The flying sword slowly came to Su Fengnian's shoulder and slightly hummed, like a little bird relying on a man, like an old horse meeting its master. The old man was scared to death. He had been away from Jianghu for many years, but his eyesight was still there. The sword-controlling art of the Wu family's sword tomb. Chapter 1473. The old man hurriedly shouted, "Young master, let's talk nicely. Don't fight. It's not easy for you and me to reach our current cultivation." The flying sword pierced forward like a bolt of lightning. The old man couldn't care less about maintaining his posture of a cross-legged expert. He quickly jumped up a few feet and dodged the flying sword that nailed into the wall. The tip of the flying sword spun and retreated, leaving some yellow soil on the wall. After putting some distance between them, the flying sword pierced forward again. The old man, who had been pretending to be a grandmaster after leaving the house, knocked the wall with his elbow and tried to climb over the wall to escape. However, the flying sword suddenly accelerated and appeared above his head. The old man had no choice but to use the 1,000-pounds falling technique. The flying sword seemed to be teasing him. Every time, intentionally or unintentionally, the old man would be able to dodge the tip of the sword and avoid the miserable fate of being pierced through. However, he would never be able to leave the wall. The old lecher, who had been trapped in the snow mountain for dozens of years, felt like dying. He kept shouting some strange words that the people of Snow Lotus City couldn't understand. "It's not the chi-controlling flying sword, it's the superior flying sword technique. Brat, who are you to the Wu family sword tomb? Why is it that even though you didn't personally raise the other person's sword, it can still be guided by your divine intent? Could it be that you're the current Wu family's sword crown, and that girl is your sword maid? This old man knows his mistake. You brat, oh, sir, please be merciful and spare her." What made the old man even more desperate was that the guy still had the leisure to raise his arm and pull out the knife, gently holding it in his hand. After half an hour, the exhausted old man was stabbed more than 20 times by the sword and hung on the wall through his mouth. The sword pierced through the wall, so it looked like a hanging corpse. Su Fengnian held the cold knife and glanced at the corpse. As if he still couldn't vent his anger, the flying sword flew out and stabbed into the wall again and again at a speed that was countless times faster than before. A series of banging sounds rang out. The corpse didn't even slide down half an inch. It was pierced into a pile of meat paste bit by bit. Su Fengnian stood up. When he looked at Lu Huaishi's adopted son, the latter crashed into the wall and died on the spot. The wall collapsed, and the two corpses disappeared from everyone's sight. What the eyes didn't see, their hearts didn't palpitate. After Su Fengnian sheathed his blade, he grabbed the scabbard that had flown back into his hand. He put the cold blade back into the scabbard and then hung it around his waist. Ignoring the group of night walkers in the alley and the Lu manor who were about to wet their pants, he made a face at the young man and woman and said with a smile, "How is it? Do you believe me now? For a true expert like me, there's no need for me to stand. Squatting is already very cool. If I were to stand, I would look so handsome that I wouldn't even dare to look in the mirror for fear of scaring myself. How could there be such a handsome and peerless expert in this world?" Jiang and I rolled his eyes and said, "Immoral." The young man stood in front of the young girl to protect her. The young girl hid behind the young man. Her teeth chattered as she whispered, "He's powerful, but his head must have been hit by a door before." The stubborn young girl pulled the young man's sleeve and asked, "Isn't that right, Twig?" The young man whispered, "Yes." However, he quickly pretended to be stupid and said, "Really?" With a thought, Su Fengnian made the long sword that he had borrowed for a moment fly back into the scabbard of the swordsman. He smiled and said, "Thank you." The man from the Central Plains, who had thought that he was already considered a top expert in the small Snow Lotus City of the Western regions, stood up and said in a deep voice, "It should be me who is thanking Senior for teaching me how to use the sword." Su Fengnian dismissed him with a smile. Then his entire aura changed and he no longer showed any signs of being defeated. He turned his head and said to Jiang and I, "In fact, my recovery is not slow. In fact, it's even faster than to Oba Bodhisattva. I could walk on my own 2 days ago. Now he and Li Mixi have entered the city. You have already saved me once. This time, I have a chance of winning. It's not certain that I will lose. Don't worry about me. Take these 2 kids and leave Snow Lotus City first. After settling them down, you can go back to West Chu." Su Fengnian paused for a moment. He blinked his eyes and said with a mischievous smile, "Maybe one day I will go and find you. At that time, you will know how powerful I am and whether I am the new martial emperor or not." Su Fengnian walked toward the alley alone. He pressed his right hand on the cold saber's hilt and turned his back to Jiang and I. "Back then, when Chao Changqing took you away, I couldn't stop him. As long as I don't die this time, no one can stop me." At this moment, the young man and the young girl saw that the swordsman suddenly stagger and almost fall to the ground. The young girl, who had been inexplicably touched, couldn't help but laugh. "He looks more handsome when he is squatting." The young man nodded. The man from the Central Plains, who had already regarded the senior swordsman who was good at retaining his looks as an immortal, also couldn't bear to look. However, while he was filled with compassion, the swordsman was also shocked. Just now, he seemed to have heard the names Tuoba Bodhisattva and Chao Changqing. This senior was not only on the same side as Chao Changqing, but his opponent was also the second strongest in the world, Tuoba Bodhisattva. He was even worthy of Tuoba Bodhisattva joining forces with others to hunt him down to Snow Lotus City. Was this senior a sword immortal who had never appeared in Jianghu? However, in the next moment he felt that it wasn't the case. In the distance, Jiang and I, whose face was stiff, came behind Su Fengnian with a long sweep. He kicked this guy to the ground and said angrily, "Are you addicted to pretending to be an expert?" Chapter 1474. Jiang and I stopped at the corner of the alley. During this escape, whether they should stop or continue, how they should fight if they stopped, whether it was a dragonfly skimming the water or not, it was all up to Su Fengnian. Tonight was not an exception. Slowly walking out of the alley, Su Fengnian gazed at the street. As expected, if one thought of the worst, that would be the case. It was very easy to worry about. If their luck was good, Li Mibi and Tuoba would enter the city half a day later. If their luck was average, the two would have already given up on him as bait and returned. Su Fengnian sighed and then looked at her with a complicated gaze. Jiang and I just quietly waited for the rest. Su Fengnian said softly, "This time, we won't follow the old rules. We have to keep an eye on that old dog Li Mixi." Those battles where Bodhisattva Tuoba was the target were actually just a smokescreen. Now that Tuoba has recovered some of his strength, he is determined to leave. Without Su Yanbing and the others stopping him, we will not be able to stop him. But like we said before, if the worst situation occurs, you retreat first, I will cover the rear. Jiang and I did not comment. She hesitated and then asked, "Do you know why Beimang is so relaxed with Gu Jiantang guarding the east?" Su Fengnian asked in response, "Is it because they are certain that the Liyang imperial court will not move?" Jiang and I sneered, "So simple?" Su Fengnian leaned against the wall and said softly, "There is news in the spy report that there is a group of people in Great Peace City who cannot hold back. They boldly suggested that the two Liao border armies should not just stare at each other and that they should cooperate with Beimang. Of course, they could not be considered as reinforcements, but they could be like Ji Zhou's Yuan Tingshan and obtain a lot of merits." However, these voices were quickly suppressed by Gu Jiantang. Among them, Su Gong, who had been patrolling the border as assistant minister, had been strongly in favor of fighting at the start. But when he suddenly changed sides and did not mention anything about attacking, he caused a lot of criticism in Great Peace City. His already low reputation hit rock bottom. Some people even said that they wanted this assistant minister of the Ministry of War to be an assistant minister of the border for the rest of his life. Fu Shui Chamber only knows that Lu Xianxiang sent an urgent letter to the capital, directly to the Imperial Study Room. As for what the letter said, Fu Shui Chamber does not have the ability to find out. Jiang and I wanted to say something but hesitated. Su Fengnian smiled and said, "Let's not talk about it. I'll just treat it as an accident on the Eastern Front. In any case, I can't care about the life and death of the two Liao countries. If the Eastern Front is ruined, it will only be Gu Jiantang's headache." Jiang and I did not give a direct answer. "Who do you think hates Gu Jiantang the most in the world?" Su Fengnian paused. Gu Jiantang was able to become one of the 4 great generals of the spring and autumn period because of his contribution in destroying the country. Not to mention the southern Tang, they did not fight much. However, when they took down Dongyue, They fought some exciting battles. The only people who have a deep hatred for Gu Jiantang should be the people of Dongyue. Su Fengnian said to herself, but even the royal family of Dongyue has been subdued. Most of the slightly famous generals are dead. The civil officials of Dongyue were the first to submit to the Zhao clan in Liang. They became Zhang Julu's lackeys in the early years of the struggle between the Zhang and the Gu. In particular, almost half of the officials of the 5 departments outside of the censorate and the Ministry of War were Dongyue civil officials. The most famous pair of censors, father and son, impeached Gu Jiantang's Ministry of War every year for 10 years after Yonghui Empress. But these people, to be honest, are just scratching an itch for Gu Jiantang, the pillar of the country. Perhaps Gu Jiantang of the 2 Liao countries would like them to scold him a few more times. Otherwise, he would not be able to hold his position. When a general is outside, he is never afraid of the civil officials of the internal court. On the contrary, he is afraid that his reputation is too good. Jiang and I sneered. Su Fengnian suddenly understood and said, "Oh." She asked doubtfully, "You really guessed it?" Su Fengnian nodded. Jiang and I curled her lips in disdain. Su Fengnian said, "Isn't it just Wang Sui?" She opened her eyes wide. Su Fengnian blinked. "Really?" She shook her head vigorously. Su Fengnian looked helpless. The 2 riders rushed to Snow Lotus City. After entering the city, the sound of the horses' hooves hitting the bluestone slabs seemed insignificant in the noisy nightless city. A few drunkards were squatting on the street outside the tavern to vomit. They inadvertently looked up and saw the faces of the 2 riders reflected in the dim light. They did not pay much attention to it. They could not suppress the movement of their throats and threw up in the direction of the 2 riders. After vomiting to their heart's content, they felt a lot more comfortable. However, they found that one of the white-haired riders was looking at them coldly. The drunkard grinned and wiped his mouth with his sleeve. Unexpectedly, as if lightning had ignited the fire on the ground, his stomach started to churn again. He put his hands on the ground and vomited. Then he felt that something was wrong. He shook his head and tried to open his eyes wide. Only then did he see a pool of blood on the slate. Then, his head hit the ground heavily and he never had the chance to open his eyes again. Drunk to death, drunk to death. The drunkard died drunk like this. The other dispirited middle-aged rider did not say anything about the old man's venting of anger. If he were in the old man's shoes, he would also have the thought of killing people indiscriminately. The old man had set up 2 big traps. The first time was to kill Yan Wenwan. This time, he wanted to kill Su Fengnian. Almost half of the top masters in Beimeng Jianghu were killed. The most important thing was that they did not succeed. The spider web that spread all the way from the southern dynasties to Beiliang was also torn into pieces. No matter how calm the old man was, he could not help but feel angry. The white-haired old man probably also realized that he had lost his composure. He laughed at himself and said softly, "King of the Northern Courtyard, please allow me to make one last bet. I bet that the guy surnamed Su Fengnian will not be willing to let the fight end in a draw. He will personally take the risk and wait for us in Snow Lotus City to take the bait. Su Yanbing and Tantai Pingjing will arrive in about 12 hours. During this period, if Su Fengnian not only takes the initiative to show up, but also deliberately shows his flaws and runs in circles with us, I can promise you that no matter how rare the opportunity is, I will stop and return to the north with peace of mind. I will leave Snow Lotus City before Su Yanbing and Tantai Pingjing enter the city." Chapter 1475. Bodhisattva Tuoba nodded. To him, this battle of life and death between the 2 of them had already ended when the sword flew over. Bodhisattva Tuoba was able to accept defeat, but he was also able to let it go. At most, he could just change the game and fight again in the future. After this battle, Tuoba could use the stones of other mountains to polish jade. Whether it was his state of mind or cultivation, he had benefited greatly. Of course, at the same time, he had become a whetstone for Su Fengnian to temper his martial arts. It was inevitable that the battle to the death in the future would only be more dangerous. Tuoba was well aware of this. However, since Li Mixi had saved his life, Tuoba would follow this shadow prime minister's wishes all the way down south. He would not deliberately raise a tiger for the sake of the battle for the number one person in the world. If he could kill Su Fengnian early on, Tuoba would not have any knot in his heart. Just as he had said to Su Fengnian before, in his eyes, Jianghu was nothing. Leaping into the Central Plains, he became the number one contributor to the founding of the new Beimang. Subsequently, he became the undisputed number one martial artist in the history books of later generations. In the past 800 years, the great Qin dynasty had lost its tripod and the various countries were vying for supremacy. The masters of the art of war and famous generals of the Central Plains were innumerable. The outstanding ones were the three generals of the great Feng dynasty, the twin annals who had almost succeeded in turning the tide before the great Feng dynasty was destroyed, the 12 generals who hung portraits in the Qingyun Pavilion after the founding of the Dechu dynasty. The 9 kingdoms of the spring and autumn confronted each other for supremacy. The 100 schools of thought and the school of the military took advantage of the situation and flourished. In the early stages, there was the war god Li Gonglin, who was known as Dechu's war god, Han Yufu, who had led the cavalry into the desert several times. Then there were the 4 great generals of the spring and autumn period, the butcher Su Shao, West Chu soldier Yi Baikui, East Yu's prince consort Wang Sui, and Gu Zhenteng. Now, there were people like Chao Chongqing, Dong Zhuo, Lu Xingxiang, and the others who began to use hundreds of thousands of soldiers as chess pieces in their hands, leading the situation of the country while talking and laughing. Even young people like Zhong Tan, Xie Shibian, and Ko Jianghuai were rising rapidly. Li Mixi raised his head and looked up. It was the moonlight of a high-rise building. The 2 lights were competing with each other. The old man suddenly laughed softly and said, "I heard that the king of the northern courtyard has never liked to pretend to be cultured. The only thing he collected was a copybook by Yuan Fengshen, the founding hero of the great Feng dynasty." Yuan Fengshen, who was known as the Great Wall of the Frontier by the founding emperor of the Feng Empire, died young. Compared to the generals of the same generation, his reputation was not prominent in history. Therefore, his ranking was extremely low. Huang Sanjia, who was more ambitious than the sky, once said that Yuan Fengshen and the prince consort Wang Sui, who held the lifeline of the country in his hands when he was only 20 years old, were listed together as the destined martial artists who did not wait for me. Tuoba did not have any good or bad impression of Li Mixi. There was no need to fear him, and there was no need to curry favor with him. In Beimang, there were only a handful of people who could have Tuoba's mentality. The former king of the northern courtyard, Su Huainan, and the 2 successive kings of the southern courtyard, Huang Songpu and Dong Zhuo, could not do it. The old man, who had devoted half his life to Beimang's great cause, sighed with emotion. "I have never liked Jianghu. It probably has something to do with what I saw and heard when I was young and traveling to study." The 9 kingdoms of spring and autumn attracted Jianghu people within their jurisdiction. Dechu saw them as sparrows in a cage. Southern Tang saw them as Tang Chenyan. Later on, Liang also gave those Jianghu people a bag of embroidered carps. The meaning is clear. You are nothing but the carps in the pond of the Zhao family. The old man let go of the reins, rubbed his hands, exhaled, and said with a smile, "All these years, I have been like a fisherman, helping His Majesty look after the small pond in front of the court. It is no wonder that the people of Liyang are conceited and always say that there is no Jianghu in Beimang. It is because they have Li Chungang, Wang Xianji, Dong Tai, Chao Chongqing, and now they have Su Fengnian leading a large group of rising stars. We indeed do not have any real Jianghu people in Beimang. 4 of the 5 major sects are all His Majesty's subordinates. You, the king of the northern courtyard, are a military general. Hong Jingyan is the Ruren lord. It was not easy for Huyen Grand Monastery and Luo Yang to come out, but they all ran to Liyang. Even you, the Beimang god of war, had to make a special trip to Liyang before the great battle of Liangmang to take a look at Mount Hui. Tuoba was somewhat surprised. In his impression, Li Mibi had always been a person who believed that 100 words were not worth 100 words. When Tuoba entered the palace for the first time by virtue of his military exploits, he saw 2 gray-haired elders sitting on the steps outside the hall nibbling on dates. Su Huainan, who controlled half the country's military, was no stranger to him. When Tuoba was young, he was able to rise in the ranks of the Norland army and stand out among the nobles with the surnames of Murong and Yelu. Su Huainan's impartiality played a huge role in Tuoba's success. That time when he had an audience with His Majesty, he had spent most of his time patiently waiting outside the hall. The one who left the deepest impression on him was the old man who swallowed dates with Su Huainan. After seeing him, the old man's gaze was like a snake coiled in a dark corner, hissing. It was especially cold. From the beginning to the end, it was Su Huainan, who was second only to one and above tens of thousands of people, who exchanged pleasantries with Tuoba. The other old man, Old Snake, who rarely slipped out of the trenches to bask in the sun, was expressionless as he nibbled on dried dates. When Tuoba was summoned into the hall to meet the emperor, he still felt a chill run down his spine. Li Mibi probably did not know that he had once shocked the future Beimang god of war. He turned his head and smiled. When Hong Jia fled north at the end of the spring and autumn period, our Beimang reaped the benefits. However, many of the survivors thought that they were rootless duckweeds and only wanted to return to their homeland. Even if they could not do it while they were alive, they wanted their descendants to bring their ashes to the south. I, Li Mibi, am the same as Su Huainan. It's just that they wanted to return to their roots, but I have never had such thoughts. There is a plant in the medical books that can treat venomous insects and snakes. It's called the dandelion. After the seeds leave the branches and leaves, they will drift far away with the wind and take root as soon as they land. Wherever they land, that is where their hometown is. Although Tuoba had never been involved in the family affairs of the Beimang and was trusted and valued by the empress, Tuoba was not unaware of the movements of the Beimang and southern dynasties over the years. Bodhisattva Tuoba could roughly guess the meaning behind Li Mixi's words. In fact, for the past 20 years, the Norland had mostly used such tricks to suppress the Hua people in the southern dynasties. They were very familiar with making groundless accusations and slandering the Hua people. However, since Li Mibi was the ancestor of the Beimang spies, Tuoba had no choice but to take it seriously. Over the years, I've only done two things. On the surface, I've taken care of the fish pond, but in the dark, I've been sweeping the fallen leaves in the courtyard. The latter is like catching butterflies that have broken out of their cocoons in foreign lands and putting them into cages one by one. I've always enjoyed it, but unfortunately, it hasn't been very effective. In the end, even His Majesty thinks that I'm making a fuss over nothing. Although he doesn't suspect that I'm raising bandits for his own sake, he's been losing interest in it over the past few years, especially after Su Huainan's death, which made His Majesty very sad. I know that His Majesty feels guilty and resentful about this matter. He feels guilty because he and his minister didn't end things well and let Su Huainan die an unnatural death. His resentment is directed at me because it was my vigilance and suspicion that gave the young man surnamed Su the opportunity to take away Su Huainan's head and bring shame to the entire Norland. However, I have a feeling that even if I have not found a single bamboo whip after 20 years of digging, there are definitely a few fish that have escaped the net with ulterior motives in the royal court and the southern court. They are hidden very deeply and are bitterly waiting for a certain opportunity. Tuoba frowned and said, "Since even you can't find them, even if there are a few fish that have escaped the net, it has been 20 years. How can they succeed?" The old man relaxed his tone and smiled. "I can't compare to the prefect of peace, nor can I compare to you, Tuoba, or Dongjua. I am an outsider to both military and political matters, and I don't have any great foresight. However, doing the dirty work that seems to happen right under my nose all year round has developed a good habit of not too big nor too small. That is to first understand the people and matters that are close to me. Otherwise, I won't be able to sleep and eat in peace. I have focused all my attention on the great clans that rise and fall. I am not like many of you who are still fighting to the death with the Baoyang cavalry. You have already set your sights on the great and city further south, the Central Plains, and the Guangling River. I have something that I have always wanted to ask, but I can't. Today, there is only the king of the northern court and me. Can you enlighten me?" Tuoba said in a low voice, "Sir, please ask." Li Mibi's tone was particularly stiff. "Has no one other than me thought that Baoyang would win and Beimang would lose?" Chapter 1476. After confirming that Wang Sui was the stabilizing force of Beimang's eastern front, Su Fengnian looked calm, but his heart was in turmoil. This news was too shocking, no less shocking than the news that Shangyin Academy's Qi Yanglong had entered the capital and become the minister of imperial command. The central plains had sunk, and countless heroes had been washed away by the waves. They had either been loyal to their country, fled from the world, or entered the Liang Temple with the bad reputation of being a slave of two surnames. Many others had concealed their names, living in the forests and the alleys of the city. Wang Mingyin, the world's 11th most famous general, Gu Dezhu, the crown prince of western Shu, Su Su and Lu Xiufu, who had fled to Beimang, and the only orphan of the Ji province's Han family, who had become a bandit in Beimang, were all like this. If Su Fengnian had not entered Jianghu and stirred up a storm, they might have remained like this, day after day, year after year, in small mud ponds, never to be seen by the world again. Wang Sui's comeback, his sudden appearance after 20 years of hibernation, was undoubtedly the most prominent, especially since he had chosen Beimang, which would inevitably have a huge and far-reaching impact on the world's situation. Because this distinguished and elegant prince consort of Dongyue, one of the 4 famous generals of the spring and autumn period, was the most superb at commanding troops, and was best at defeating powerful enemies with a small number of troops. He was the Qi in the Chu Yu Qi Zheng of the spring and autumn period, and truly stood shoulder to shoulder with the military master Yi Baikuei. As a matter of fact, Su Xiao, who had not been conferred the title of king at that time, was known for his invincible iron cavalry of the Su family. His personal deployment of troops and generals could not be mentioned in the same breath as Yi Baikuei and Wang Sui. Regarding this, Su Xiao had never concealed it in front of his children. Ren Tu, who rarely praised people of the same generation, had never concealed his admiration for Wang Sui. Even Li Yishan had said that if Yi Baikuei, who considered himself the teacher of the king's way, was replaced by Wang Sui, who was good at sneak attacks, who liked to move troops on a large scale, who was good at maneuvering, and who never fought with his back against the wall, the Su family's troops and horses would not be able to complete the encirclement at the Battle of the Western Wall. It was a great misfortune that Wang Sui was in Beimang. Fortunately, Wang did not appear in Liangmang's battlefield, but was in the eastern front to contain Gu Jianghu's 300,000 Liao border army. There was also a son-in-law of the emperor's son-in-law, surnamed Wang, and a son-in-law of the emperor of emperors. Coincidentally, a son-in-law of Wang. There was a son-in-law of a certain city, surnamed Wangs. A son-in-law of A's. Wang Xinji and Wang Sui. One was a Jianghu grandmaster who never cared about the prosperity or decline of the imperial court. The other was a prince consort with real power who rested on a beauty's knee when he was sober. Seeing Su Fengnian fall into silence and become more and more serious, Jiang and I calmly said, "Back then, when we were traveling in Beimang, Uncle Chao and I visited Wang Sui. Uncle Chao advised Wang Sui that he could work for De Chu, but he was rejected. Wang Sui said that Dongyue's loss to Liang was due to the general trend and not because of war. As for the destruction of Dongyue, there was no knot in his heart that couldn't be untied. However, losing to Gu Jianghu was his second greatest humiliation, after losing to Wang Xinji when he was young. He wanted to fight with Gu Jianghu again under the circumstances of equal military strength and power." Su Fengnian muttered to himself, "You're already in your 60s, how can you still be so childish? Military affairs are not child's play. You punched me today, so I'll kick you again tomorrow." Jiang and I had a strange expression. "Wang Sui mentioned you before. After he heard that you were practicing the saber, he made a bet with Uncle Chao. Wang Sui bet that you would definitely become a martial arts grandmaster in the future." Su Fengnian smiled and said, "What's there to bet on? Isn't it obvious that it's a done deal? Your uncle is also willing to place a bet. Isn't he just a spendthrift who is willing to spread wealth? What's the bet?" Jiang and I said unhappily, "Uncle Chao didn't say that you couldn't become a grandmaster. He only put your achievements at the same level as his own. However, Wang Sui said that you could fight with Wang Xinji." Su Fengnian touched his prickly stubble that hadn't been shaved for more than half a year. "Wang Sui has a unique foresight. If there's a chance, I'll definitely treat this old fellow to a drink." Just based on his foresight, I'll toast him 3 big cups first. Jiang and I smiled for the first time. Do you know why Wang Sui thought so highly of you when you were just a first-tier Vajra realm martial artist? Su Fengyan couldn't guess what Wang Sui, a 1,000-year-old tortoise, was thinking. He casually replied, appearance? Jiang and I seemed to have suffered a heavy blow and was speechless. Su Fengyan was astonished. Wang Sui really judged people based on appearance? Jiang and I was in a bad mood and didn't want to talk anymore. Su Fengyan started to ponder on it. Wang Sui was born in a noble family. When he was young, he abandoned all restraints and was a chivalrous person. He only turned over a new leaf when he was 20 years old. He had only practiced martial arts for 5 years and was proficient in all kinds of martial arts. His swordsmanship was especially outstanding. Even Swordpool's Song Yanqing and Chai Qingshan had praises for him. When Wang Sui was young, he was also publicly recognized as a handsome man in Dongyue. Those ladies with outstanding backgrounds in the imperial court all liked to call him Sandalwood. In that case, he is a kindred spirit like me. No wonder. Jiang and I couldn't help but want to kick. Su Fengyan had expected this and turned his head to glare. Probably because she was used to being bullied in her early years, even though she was a female sword immortal who could travel thousands of miles in the wind, she still instinctively pulled her foot back. Su Fengyan was still angry. Speak, who did you learn this from? Chao Changqing or old Grand Preceptor Sun Shiji? Jiang Ni's face was cold as she muttered, why do you care? Su Fengyan rubbed his butt. That kick in the small alley not long ago had destroyed the air of an expert that he had worked so hard to cultivate. His face was suddenly filled with anger as he snorted strangely. I heard that there is a young pretty boy in your West Chu temple. His surname is Song, and he is so famous that even in Great Peace City, it is said that his face is white, his appearance is beautiful, and he is as solemn as the wind under the pine trees, tall and gentle. Many people have nothing better to do and say that this guy often travels the mountains and rivers and is mistaken by the village woodcutter as an immortal who has come down to the mortal world. Even Qi Yanglong praised him in front of Zhao Zhuan, saying that the one surnamed Song has outstanding literary talent. Among the young scholars in the world, his poems and essays are like the dragon in the Dragon Palace. Only this person has obtained a pearl, the rest are just the claws of a dragon. So now, Liang has the saying of dragon and phoenix poise, which is to say this guy's literary talent, and Jiang and I pretended to be confused and interrupted Su Fengyan's chatter. I have heard of the dragon and phoenix poise. As for Song Maolin, he is the youngest Hanlin scholar in the history of Dechu. If it wasn't for Uncle Chao, he would also be the youngest chessman waiting for the imperial decree. But as for dragon and phoenix poise, Northern Su and Southern Song, or Song Maolin's essays reflecting the beauty of so-and-so, I don't know anything about them. Su Fengyan laughed angrily. That pretty boy dares to be ranked with me? I can take down 1,000 Song Maolins with one hand. Didn't he just write a careless declaration? I think it's just that. Immortal my ass. Jiang and I still had that innocent look in her eyes. So it's like this. If I remember correctly, Grand Preceptor's son once praised him for writing a declaration that was equivalent to 100,000 soldiers. Then she lowered her head and started counting with her fingers. Li Yang's secretary Qi Yanglong said that his literary talent is good, and he has the style of an immortal. Tantanon said that this person's imperial examination writing skills are not inferior to Sun Yin's. The Imperial College's left chancellor Yao Baifeng said that he is knowledgeable and reasonable. In addition, our Dechu's Grand Preceptor's son said that his declaration writing is imposing. Uncle Chao said that his chess skills are only slightly inferior to Fan Zhangho's. Out of the 10 most knowledgeable people in the world, 5 of them said good things about him. Let me count again, there seems to be. Su Fengyan rolled her eyes. Stop. That pretty boy only has a little bit of fame in the scholarly world. Look at your so-called so-and-so again? Jiang and I deliberately looked left and right, but she didn't look at Su Fengyan. Who is it? Where is it? Why can't I see it? Su Fengyan stretched out his hand and gently pressed Jiang Ni's forehead, not allowing her to shake her head. Jiang and I slapped his hand away and said disdainfully, "Are you bored? Why are you concerned about a scholar from Guangling who is far away on the horizon? Beimang's million-strong army is pressing on Beiliang's border. Can you take care of them all?" Chapter 1477. Su Fengnian looked into Jiang Ni's eyes and asked softly, "It is said that most of the civil officials in the West Chu imperial court have suggested Song Maolin and you." Jiang and I once again interrupted Su Fengnian's words. Her expression was normal and her tone was calm, as if she was talking about a small matter that had nothing to do with her. Previously, there was someone who suggested Ko Jianghuai, followed by Xie Shibian, and then Song Maolin. Su Fengnian's face was gloomy. He asked in a deep voice, "What is Chao Changqing doing? If he is too busy to take care of you, Princess de Chu, then I didn't see him fight all the way to Great Peace City. If he is very free, then can't he control a few mouths in the imperial court? How can he restore his country like this?" Jiang and I shook her head and said, "Uncle Chao is already very good." Su Fengnian wanted to say something but stopped. Jiang and I gently exhaled and looked at the dim street in the distance. "What do you say? Should we take the initiative to fight or wait for them to come to us?" Su Fengnian instantly returned to his sloppy self. "It wasn't easy for me to accumulate such an imposing aura, but you kicked it away. Then let's wait. Snow Lotus City is neither big nor small. We still have about 2 hours." Jiang and I asked doubtfully, "Don't leave? Anyway, we have been running all the way. We don't care about this time, right?" Su Fengnian did not say anything. He turned and walked back into the alley. Jiang and I silently followed behind him. Ma Jiabao's daughter, Ma Shigong, and the poor youth, Hong Shuji, were still there. The swordsman from the Central Plains also did not leave. Obviously, he had not given up on the Snow Lotus. Seeing the sword immortal, Senior, and the beautiful woman with the box on her back return with complicated expressions, the middle-aged man knew that the two immortals were also here for the Snow Lotus. He would not be able to snatch it from them. Even if he begged, he would not be able to get it. However, when he thought of the woman who had to rely on Liaodong ginseng to survive every month, the man gritted his teeth and cupped his fists to Su Fengnian. "Senior, can you give me the Snow Lotus? Junior Xiaomu is willing to exchange his life for it." Su Fengnian was stunned for a moment before he shook his head and said, "I must have this Snow Lotus. There's nothing to discuss." Xiaomu's expression was sorrowful. After closing his eyes, he suddenly opened them and said resolutely, "Then I can only ask Senior for advice." Su Fengnian waved his hand and smiled, "Why don't you wait for a night? If I'm still in the city at dawn, you can exchange your life for the Snow Lotus in Lu Huaishi's mansion. If I'm already out of the city, you can do business with that kid again. You're just helping him go to Ma Family Fort. With your strength as a level 2 master, it shouldn't be difficult for you to take over a private fort." A young girl with a strange name plucked up her courage and retorted, "Our Ma Family Fort's guard instructor is known as Iron Spear Wei in the martial world. He has a reed leaf spear made of refined iron and is 12 feet long. Just the tip of the spear is 1 foot and 3 inches long. It is very powerful. I once saw Instructor Wei pierce through 3 iron armors with his spear. Besides, our Ma Family Fort also has a cavalry army that comes and goes like the wind. Even General Lu's mansion in Snow Lotus City doesn't dare to underestimate our Ma Family Fort." Xiaomu laughed it off. On the other hand, Su Fengnian squatted on the stairs beside Xiaomu and said with a smile, "It sounds like your family is very strong. Let me ask you a question. Are your ancestors local or migrated from the Central Plains?" The young girl carefully said, "Why are you asking this?" Su Fengnian saw that she didn't want to answer, so he didn't ask any more. He began to concentrate and rest. Xiaomu hesitated for a long time and finally couldn't help but ask curiously, "Senior, do you really want to compete with Toba Bodhisattva of Beimang?" Su Fengnian nodded. Even Xiaomu, who was used to seeing all kinds of storms, was speechless. Since he was able to fight with Beimang's military god, he should at least be a level 1 mysterious finger. He might even be able to touch the legendary threshold of celestial state, right? Jiang and I didn't want to see this guy pretending to be profound, so he snorted and said, "Has the fight been going on for more than half a month? The winner hasn't been decided yet." Xiao Mu's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. He swallowed his saliva. Su Fengnian smiled and didn't say anything. Although Xiao Mu had stayed in Snow Lotus City, which was far away from the Central Plains, he couldn't figure out who had such a great ability. Was he blind? Was the senior sitting beside him the peach blossom sword god Dong Tai? Otherwise, among the experts who used the sword, Song Nianxing of the sword pool and the #1 swordsman in the southeast, Chai Qingshan, were both old men. Tongxi sword goddess Lu Baijie didn't have such ability. Their ages didn't match. While Xiao Mu was rushing to Snow Lotus City from the Central Plains, he heard that Wu Luding, the sword crown of the Wu family's sword tomb, was traveling with a female sword servant. The old man who died under the sword of the senior also guessed the same and mentioned the sword nurturing and the flying sword. However, Xiaomu didn't think that Wu Luding could reach the level of fighting with Toba Bodhisattva for more than half a month in just a few years. No matter how amazing a martial arts genius was, it wasn't difficult for him to reach the first level without many life-threatening battles and the feeding of many top grandmasters. However, it was still difficult for him to reach the level of one of the top 10 martial artists. An hour later, the girl was sleepy and the boy forced his eyelids open. Su Fengnian raised his arm and the 6-year phoenix fell from the night sky. Su Fengnian took out the secret letter in the slender bamboo tube and felt relieved. Jiang and I looked at him inquiringly. Su Fengnian said happily, Su Yanbing left everyone behind and killed his way to Snow Lotus City alone. He can enter the city in an hour at most. Jiang and I said, then I'll wait for an hour. Su Fengnian shook his head and said, no need. Since Su Yanbing arrived earlier than I expected, you can return to Guangling Road without worry. Then Su Fengnian turned his head and said to the boy and Xiao Mu, Hong Shuji, go and get that snow lotus. I'll help you fulfill your wish. Xiao Mu, I'll be able to get Lu Huaishi's snow lotus for you by tomorrow morning at the latest. Remember to rush to Bailiang immediately after you deliver the snow lotus. You can protect your name in any of the relay stations in Yuzhou or Lingzhou. Someone will bring you to me when the time comes. In short, I'll take your life. The boy was half excited and half nervous. He blushed and asked, really? Su Fengnian gently waved his arm and made the gerfalcon return to the night sky. He nodded and said, you've seen how good my swordsmanship is with your own eyes. The boy jumped up and down happily. He hurriedly went into the house and took out an iron box. The box was filled with ice and the snow lotus was wrapped in ice. Su Fengnian took the box and handed it to the puzzled Jiang and I. This is for you. Su Fengnian pointed at the wound on her neck and then at his cheek. He said with a smile, Snow Lotus is probably the best thing for a girl to maintain her beauty. Without giving Jiang and I a chance to refuse, Su Fengnian looked at her and said calmly, also, pass a message to Chao Chongqing. Tell him not to worry. There are some places that the Bailiang cavalry are familiar with. Su Fengnian blinked. If you don't mind passing a message for me, please tell that pretty boy surnamed Song that I'll beat him up until his parents can't recognize him. Jiang and I hugged the box and didn't say anything. Su Fengnian said with a smile, it's only an hour. I actually need to fight Toba Bodhisattva and Li Mibi alone. I want Toba Bodhisattva's state of mind to be completely damaged so that I'll have a better chance of winning the next time we fight. Don't worry. Once the situation turns bad, it'll be easy for me to run away. I've been recuperating all this time. It's enough for me to play cat and mouse with them for an hour. Jiang and I was still silent. Su Fengnian joked, what, you don't want to leave? Jiang and I spat. Su Fengnian waved his hand. Go, go. Jiang Ni's expression was stiff and cold. She turned around and the great Liang dragon sparrow flew out of the red sandalwood sword box and floated in front of her. She gently jumped on it and disappeared like a rainbow in an instant. Xiao Mu was dumbfounded once again. Another goddamn sword immortal? When did the streets of Liang become so full of sword immortals? The young man grinned at the girl. I told you she's really a fairy sister. The girl stepped on the back of the young man's foot. The young man stood on one leg and bared his teeth. About half an hour later, the girl looked at the man standing on the steps and looking in the direction where the fairy disappeared. She asked softly, you lied to her, didn't you? Su Fengnian smiled and turned to Xiao Mu. Take the 2 children to the Snow Lotus parlor and tell them that I promise to give you a stalk of snow lotus. Madame Song will help you ask Lu Huaishi for it at all costs. Then, let the Snow Lotus parlor settle them down. Let's go through the back door. When Xiao Mu left with the boy and girl, they vaguely heard the sound of horse hooves coming from a distant alley. Chapter 1478. After the 2 of them entered the alley, their horses slowed down. The lights in the city dimmed, making the moonlight even more intense. Li Mibi chuckled softly and said, "That guy surnamed Su finally realized that it was the woman's dense sword chi that revealed their tracks, which made her leave Snow Lotus City first. Within 100 miles, even if the great Liang dragon sparrow is hidden in the box, I can still vaguely see it as a flickering firefly 10 feet away. However, it can be seen that although West Chu's Jiang and I is a sword embryo that appears once in 100 years, it is still far from reaching the legendary realm of the world's ruler. Without Jiang and I holding the line, that young man has no chance of winning. The key is to see if God will give him the luck to escape again." Along the way, they had the absolute initiative. Now that the battle of life and death was imminent, Su Fengnian unexpectedly made a stupid move and broke his own wings. However, Tuoba Bodhisattva's expression did not seem relaxed. It shouldn't be that simple. In these years of life and death battles, Su Fengnian, Yang Taisui, Han Shengxian, Wang Xianji, Huang Qing, and the Bronze Man ancestor were all in the position to win. However, the one who survived in the end was Su Fengnian. This is not something that can be explained by luck. Speaking of this, Tuoba Bodhisattva laughed. If it wasn't for Mr.'s timely arrival, I would be no exception and become another stepping stone for Su Fengnian. For tonight's battle, Mr. might as well hide in the dark. I have almost recovered and can fight head-on with Su Fengnian. Whether Su Fengnian and Jiang and I have some tricks up their sleeves, or he admits that he has no way out and only wants to die with me, Mr. will be able to deal with it calmly. Li Mixi thought for a while and nodded. Without hesitation, his figure flashed on the horse's back. In the eyes of this ancestor of spies who had been entrenched in the center of Beimang's spiderweb for many years, if he had not interfered in the battle between Su Fengnian and Tuoba Bodhisattva, in terms of life and death, Su Fengnian would have won. However, in terms of victory and defeat, Tuoba Bodhisattva was still slightly better. Therefore, Tuoba Bodhisattva did not have any knot in his heart regarding his attack. That perfect and flawless state of mind also did not have any cracks. Li Mibi himself was the #1 Xianfinger Xian after the death of Han Shengxian in Ling. He knew better than anyone the principle that it was difficult to repair a broken state of mind. Not everyone could recover to the peak after the state of mind fell like Li Chungang. If your state of mind is not damaged in the slightest, you won't be able to recover in 100 years. Moreover, Su Fengnian's injuries were far more serious than Tuoba Bodhisattva's. It could be assumed that the speed of his recovery and the recovery of his body was much slower than Tuoba Bodhisattva's. In the Battle of Snow Lotus City, Li Mibi really could not find a reason why Su Fengnian could win by luck. However, if Su Fengnian insisted on avoiding the battle and escaping, Li Mibi was not conceited enough to think that he could kill Su Fengnian. If one did not enter the first class, or even the first-class Vajra realm, one would forever be a frog at the bottom of the well, unable to see the spectacular scenery outside the well. Only when a martial artist successfully entered the Xianfinger realm and could perceive the circulation of the world, could he be considered a person above the well and move with the flow, like a fish swimming in the vast net of law. As for the celestial state and the more unfettered earth immortals, they could even sit on the ground and bargain with God. Li Mibi felt a little regretful. Because he was the shadow prime minister of Beimang, he had done too many things in his life that might have gone according to his wishes but definitely went against the world's rules. He did not dare to enter the celestial state because he was afraid that when the time came, he would be caught in a trap of his own making. Li Mibi believed that Han Shengxian had never really crossed the threshold of celestial state in his life because he had this layer of concern. Li Mibi believed that there was God's will in the unseen world. If one was too selfish, it would certainly not be tolerated by the way of heaven. Li Mibi appeared and disappeared mysteriously and came to the corner of the cornice of a tall building. The back of the cornice under his feet was not carved with common spirit beasts such as Kylin, which could ward off evil spirits and pray for blessings. Instead, it was a lively carp with a lively posture. It was probably due to the unique water affinity of the buildings in the central plains. A wind chime was tied to a rope under the eaves, moving with the wind, melodious and light. The distance between here and the small house in the alley was only a straight line distance of 500 steps. Looking down from the high ground, Li Mibi could have a clear view of the situation there. The battle that did not alarm Snow Lotus City was about to break out. In addition to paying attention to the peak battle between the two sides who were both great masters, Li Mibi had been paying attention to the direction where Xianxia flew away on his sword. Li Mibi suddenly laughed out loud and sighed with emotion. It was an unprecedented big year in Jianghu. There were as many experts as there were clouds. Even if many of the older generation died, the younger generation emerged faster. It was undoubtedly the grandest occasion in 1,000 years. The 14 people in the martial arts competition, including the 4 great masters and the top 10 experts, were all great celestial phenomenon or even earth immortals without exception. Not to mention Zhang Enai, who could fly 1,000 miles on his sword. Shenyuan Qingfeng, who was already in the celestial phenomenon realm, would definitely be among the top 10 experts in Jianghu in the past. However, he was unfortunate to encounter such an era. If the white-robed monk Qi Beware and other hidden experts were added, Shenyuan Qingfeng might not even have a place in the top 20. In addition to these grandmasters and grandmasters who were already well known to the public, there was also the number 1 beauty under the heavens, who had followed after the devil Luoyang in the northern Mang territory, the unfathomable young Wudong sect leader Li Yufu, Jiang Fuding, who stood at the top of the martial emperor city in the eastern sea, Zhao Ningxin, who had walked down the mountain from the celestial master manor, Qi Xianxia, who had traveled among the common people, sword. Tomb sword crown Wu Luding and that female sword attendant, and even Su Fengyan's 3 disciples were gradually showing their talents. If the world's experts could choose 2 people to fight, the battle between the military god of Beimang and the king of Bailiang in front of Li Mibi was probably only comparable to the battle between the Confucian saint Chao Changqing and the sword immortal Dong Tai. For some reason, Li Mibi bent over and sat cross-legged, no longer paying attention to the movement in the alley. He closed his eyes and let the cool breeze caress his face. The old man with a head full of frost and snow took out a dry biscuit from his bosom and chewed leisurely. Listening to the sound of the wind chimes close by, the old man shook his head as if he was enjoying it. After finishing the biscuit and wiping his mouth, the old man slowly got up and looked up at the night sky with the moon and sparse stars. He laughed heartily and said, "Hum hum hum hum. This world and this scene, the danger is great." In the alley far away, he welcomed Tuoba Bodhisattva with a clean and vigorous saber. Thunder rises in silence, moonlight rises on the flat ground. Tuoba Bodhisattva leaped high from the horse's back. Almost at the same time, Su Fengyan chopped the tall horse that was jogging in the alley into 2 halves with his saber. After passing through the horse's corpse, he tapped the wall with the tip of his foot and swung his saber at Tuoba Bodhisattva, who was more than 10 feet above the ground. It was unclear whether it was the light of the saber or the moonlight, but the sky above the secluded alley was covered in white. Tuoba Bodhisattva clenched his fists and made a hammering posture towards the bright light of the saber. Su Fengyan held the old-style Bailiang saber with both hands and did not resist the hammering. Instead, he turned around with his saber and spun in a big circle. In an instant, the 2 of them changed positions and came to Su Fengyan, who was higher behind Tuoba Bodhisattva. He slashed his saber at Tuoba Bodhisattva's back. Tuoba Bodhisattva's chi was heavy and his falling speed was much faster than the light of the saber. After his feet touched the ground, the king of the northern courtyard, who was still in a squatting position, knocked his separated fists on the ground and turned his body. When the momentum of the saber weakened a little, he faced it head-on. With his back facing the ground, he kicked like a whip towards Su Fengyan, who was still unwilling to stop his saber and change to a new stance. Tuoba Bodhisattva loosened his grip on the saber and placed his hand on the back of the saber. With a slight twist, the saber turned sideways and collided with Tuoba Bodhisattva's whip kick. Instantly, the sound of metal colliding with stone was heard, like the chime of a huge bell. Su Fengnian and Tuoba Bodhisattva fell to the ground at the same time like two meteors. Coincidentally, one of them stood at the end of the alley and the other landed at the end. They rushed forward at the same time. While running, Su Fengnian did not look dispirited at all. Instead, he was high-spirited and full of vigor. He did not have the exhaustion of an arrow at the end of its flight when Jiang and I was beside him. It was even harder to believe that this guy would stagger and need to lean against the wall to walk. When the two of them were 10 steps apart, Su Fengnian twisted his body and spun his saber with him. In a short period of time, the slash was filled with vigor. Even Tuoba Bodhisattva did not face this attack head-on. With his back against the wall, his footsteps did not stop. When he brushed past Su Fengnian, he pushed out his palm and pushed it towards Su Fengnian's temple. Su Fengnian lowered his head and bent his waist. He spun on the spot and slashed his saber across his waist. Tuoba Bodhisattva, who had missed his punch, did not continue to tangle with him. He continued to rush forward and still did not face the attack head-on. Su Fengnian chased after him. He slightly increased the strength of his left leg and rushed diagonally to the wall. He stretched out his leg and stepped on the wall of the alley. In the next moment, his body crashed into the wall on the other side. This repeated repeatedly as he chased after Tuoba Bodhisattva. He and Tuoba Bodhisattva started a silent battle in this unknown alley. From the moment the two of them collided after landing on the ground, Su Fengnian's two sabers did not leave any marks on the floor or walls of the alley. Tuoba Bodhisattva's punch also did not leave a hole on the wall. There was not even a finger-sized hole. What happened next was still an unusual and strange situation. It was a narrow alley that only allowed two people to ride side by side. Although Su Fengnian was moving with his saber, he did not release any saber light. Only when the moonlight shone on his cold saber did it reflect a white light. It was obvious that Tuoba Bodhisattva was able to attack less and defend more than attack. However, Su Fengnian did not have the self-destructive aura that he had when he was in a life-and-death battle. Both of them attacked quickly and stopped even faster. They were as fast as lightning and thunder. There was nothing else that could be shown. This kind of subtle battle could not even be compared to the battle between two second-grade masters from Xianxia County. The two great masters who were qualified to not talk about etiquette with the King of Heaven and Earth were polite and restrained in this alley. They did not overstep the rules and did not cross the line at all. They were like gentlemen. Chapter 1479. There was no majesty that could uproot mountains and rivers. There was no unbridled joy. There was only a little restraint. Instead, it was like a woman's embroidery, with only the slightest struggle. But once it succeeded, there might be one less great guru in the world. Both of them tacitly drew a circle around the ground. The alley was a cage. A fight in a cage. Both of them only wanted to stab each other in the mirror of the state of mind. Among the 4 great gurus in the world, other than the 2 who were fighting, Chao Changqing used the way of the king to enter the way of the overbearing. It was clearly the way of the deaf. The 4 chairs placed at the top of martial arts, Chao Changqing had stood up and left his seat. Then, only Dong Tai, the champion of the way of the sword, was left. The winner of tonight's fight would not only determine their life and death, but could also seize the opponent's state to a large extent. In the future, when he fought with Dong Tai, he would undoubtedly have the upper hand. Therefore, it could be said that tonight's fight could almost determine who would be the undisputed number 1 in the world in the future. At this moment, both of them tilted their heads. Tuoba Bodhisattva's fist seemed to be resting on his left shoulder. Su Fengnian's cold blade also seemed to be lifted by Tuoba Bodhisattva's shoulder. Su Fengnian's hair did not move. The cold blade in his hand seemed to have touched the tip of the wall, but in fact, it did not pierce the wall at all. In the next moment, Tuoba Bodhisattva's knee hit Su Fengnian's abdomen. Su Fengnian also punched Tuoba Bodhisattva's chest. Both of them collided backward. Their feet slid out on the bluestone floor. Tuoba Bodhisattva pressed down with his right hand. The moment his back was about to touch the wall, he stopped moving backward. Su Fengnian shook his wrist holding the blade. Similarly, he did not touch the wall. Tuoba Bodhisattva waved his hand and hit Su Fengnian's side. Su Fengnian hit Tuoba Bodhisattva's face with his blade at the same time. After both of them fell out, they stood still. Su Fengnian twitched the corner of his mouth. Tuoba Bodhisattva was expressionless, but the mark on his face was clearly visible. Li Mixi wanted him dead. Tuoba Bodhisattva wanted him to lose and then die. Just as the girl had guessed based on her intuition, Su Fengnian was lying. At that time, the report he received from Lun Yanfeng was not the good news that Su Yambing would quickly arrive. Instead, when the imperial edict allowing 10,000 Shu soldiers to leave the borders of western Shu, Bailiang had already confirmed that Chen Jibao and Xie Guanying had quietly appeared among the Qingzhou navy. This was a secret intelligence report from Shu Xiu, who was traveling with King of Jing and Zhao Sun. This meant that even before Chen Jibao led the Shu troops into the battlefield, he could have a direct impact on the Guangling River battle. At this time, with or without Jiang and I in the army, the situation of the entire West Chu would be completely different. Other than the time when Su Fengnian woke up and fled, he had been lying to her. With the Buddha bowl given by the chicken soup monk, Su Fengnian's recovery speed was not slower than Tuoba Bodhisattva, who was lighter. Instead, it was faster. Without this secret intelligence, Su Fengnian would continue to lie, pretending that he was half dead, pretending that he needed her to carry him all the way to escape, pretending that without her, he would not be able to withstand Tuoba Bodhisattva and Li Mixi's pursuit for even a moment. And the little mud man, who was never smart, was indeed kept in the dark. She did not ask why he could escape from the pursuit every time, why he could see through Li Mixi's killing moves at just the right time, and why he could give pointers from the side. Moreover, every time he commented on the gains and losses after the battle, he could make her advance by leaps and bounds in the way of the sword with just a few words. He originally wanted to have a fair fight with Tuoba Bodhisattva in Shuelian City. In addition to letting her watch and benefit from the battle, it was more like fulfilling the wish of his youth and proving one thing to her. "What? You said that I only know how to bully you? How is that possible? As long as I really want to practice martial arts, not to mention the top 10 masters, even if Wang Xianji did not dare to call herself the #1 in the world, it would be a piece of cake." At that time, when they parted outside the city, he could give her the snow lotus and boast shamelessly, "This is a reward from the #1 master in the world." On the tall building in the distance, Li Mixi's mood gradually became serious from the beginning of his leisure. He looked at the sky. It was almost dawn. After a full 6 hours, the two people in the alley still could not decide who was the winner. It was not that Li Mixi did not want to interfere or loot a burning house. Even if he angered the king of the northern courtyard, as long as Li Mixi could kill Su Fengnian, he did not care what Tuoba Bodhisattva thought. However, Li Mixi left the tall building and approached the alley several times, but he did not find any flaws. After repeated this several times without success, Li Mixi had to stand on the roof patiently. Several times, he looked at a place dozens of miles away from the city and became more worried. At first, he could catch the sword chi within 300 miles, but after half a day, he could only shorten it to 200 miles. Before he reached Shuelian City, it was only 100 miles. Now, it was only 50 miles, but it had become vague. It seemed that it would not be long before a female sword fairy appeared in the world. Li Mixi continued to wait. When the sky was slightly brighter, the world gradually turned blue and white. Li Mixi sighed regretfully and flew down the building, landing at the end of the alley. Su Fengnian and Tuoba Bodhisattva had just pulled apart the distance between them again. Su Fengnian knelt on one knee, his cold blade drawing a long groove on the ground in front of him. Tuoba Bodhisattva did not feel good either. He sat on the ground, panting heavily for the first time. Li Mixi stood not far away from Tuoba Bodhisattva and did not speak. Tuoba Bodhisattva sighed softly and stood up. He said calmly, "It's meaningless, let's go." Li Mixi nodded. If he continued to waste time, when Su Yambing arrived, he would be caught like a turtle in a jar. Before Tuoba Bodhisattva turned around, he looked at the young man who had also stood up and said with a smile, "Even if the Bailiang cavalry is completely wiped out, no matter how exhausted you are, as long as you, Su Fengnian, say the word, I will fight you alone." Su Fengnian stood with his blade in hand, silent. Chapter 1480. When Tuoba Bodhisattva and Li Mibi returned to the north, There was also a purple rainbow outside the city that headed east. After the battle, the cold blade in Su Fengnian's hand could not bear the burden and broke into two. He bent down to pick up the broken blade and put it back into the scabbard first. After traveling 30 miles north of Snow Lotus City, the two turned west. Li Mibi finally spoke and shook his head with a smile. The king of Baoyang is young, but he is very scheming. Tuoba Bodhisattva suddenly asked, "Sir, do you know why you did not fight to the death last night and only competed with him in the state of mind?" Li Mibi thought about it but still could not figure it out. Or rather, he was unwilling to believe the truth. Tuoba Bodhisattva smiled. Using fate energy to transform into a cultivation base that has nothing to do with the state, Su Fengnian, who is in a treasure mountain, can squander it at any time. However, he still has a sense of propriety and only managed to ensure that he does not die. Su Fengnian's first strike in the alley was to tell me this fact, to tell us not to push him too far. If it was just a competition of qi, Su Fengnian would not have lost. Between you and me, one of us might have been left behind. It's just that he probably wants to leave more resources for his crumbling northern Liang. Li Mibi sighed. Fate energy, Baoyang's fate energy. Tuoba Bodhisattva said in a low voice, "I will not go to Liuzhou first. I will go back to the southern court with you to remind His Majesty and the imperial decree of peace." Li Mibi suddenly got angry and sneered. "You always say that Beimeng's Jianghu is not a real Jianghu. Then Su Fengnian, who is second to none as a great guru in Liang, is not even cool in a fight. When has he ever done anything cool? Chao Chongqing, Gu Jiantang and the rest are the same. Only Dong Tai is worthy of his name." Tuoba Bodhisattva's expression did not change. He reached out to wipe the blood from his nose and said indifferently, "A pitiful person has his own detestable side. A laughable person has his own respectable side. Therefore, I hope that Su Fengnian will die in my hands and not under the hooves of the Sword Emperor of West Shu." In Snow Lotus City, a young man carrying a saber stood in front of a small shop that sold meat naan with a worried expression. The shopkeeper waited for a long time, but didn't see this fellow take out his money pouch. He rolled his eyes, and after a long time, he stopped paying attention to this poor bastard. "What's wrong? I'm a man, not one of those young and foolish girls or ferocious women. Do you think you can eat for free just because you look like a dog? Just because he had a saber on his waist, he was considered a master of chivalry? Who are you trying to scare?" Not long after, his wife and daughter, who came to the shop to help, glanced at the young man shyly, which gave the man a headache and a toothache. He wanted to give the young man the smallest meat naan so that he could get out of the shop, but his shameless wife had already given his daughter 2 pieces of meat naan with the most weight. Then his daughter shamelessly shook her waist and stood in front of the young bastard. She timidly handed the meat naan to him and said with a smile that she would not take his copper coins. The man fiercely turned his head away. Out of sight, out of mind. Mother **Ker, I was much more handsome than you when I was young, okay? Just when the young man reached out to take the meat naan with a bright smile, an angry voice sounded beside him, "Do you have any shame?" Then she stared at the young girl. "How much is it?" The young girl was stunned and replied, "1 meat naan is 6 copper coins, 2 are 5 copper coins." She turned around with her back to the young man and carefully took out about 7 or 8 auspicious talismans from a beautiful money pouch. Most of them were small coins of 1 copper coin, and there were 2 of them with a discount of 2 copper coins. There weren't many big coins. Talismans issued during the auspicious talisman era were all new money, and they had nothing to do with the famous spring water from the previous dynasty. She muttered to herself, but in the end, she was really reluctant to hand over the 5 small coins of 1 copper coin, and she was also reluctant to take out the copper coin with a face value of 10 copper coins because she only had these 2 coins in her money pouch. They came in pairs, and it was not good to separate them. In the end, she could only frown and give the young girl 1 small coin of 1 copper coin and 2 coins with a discount of 2 copper coins. It was exactly 5 copper coins to buy 2 meat naans. The conflicted expression on her face was as if she was watching her daughter get married. The young girl and the woman in the shop didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It was only 5 copper coins. Why was she so reluctant to part with them? The young man stopped her and said softly with a smile, "Okay, Okay, you don't need to spend money. Take it. The young man with a sword turned his head and looked into the distance. He waved his hand and soon, a tall and sturdy man with a respectful expression ran over. The young man asked, "Do you have any silver coins?" The man was also one of the top experts in Snow Lotus City, but he still nodded his head in fear when facing this young man. He took out all the silver coins he had on him, and he was so respectful that he even wanted to give up his life. The young man only asked for 1 silver coin and gave it to the young girl. He took the meat naan and said with a smile, "Keep the change." The young girl, whose heart was swayed by the smile, said sweetly, "Thank you, young master." The young girl beside him turned her head and put the copper coins back. Her lips moved slightly, and her face was full of disdain. Judging from the shape of her lips, she should be saying the words, "Thank you, young master." The young man smiled and gave her a freshly baked and fragrant meat naan. Then he said, "I won't see you off. Remember not to leave the city on your sword. It's very scary in broad daylight." The young girl, who was carrying a purple box, took the meat naan and walked straight to the city gate. He waited until her figure slowly disappeared from his sight, and then he walked away with his back to her. The tall and sturdy man, who was Madame Song's personal retainer in the Snow Lotus house, kept his head down and didn't dare to look at them. He lowered his head and bit the meat naan. The meat naan was covered with scarlet blood. In the distance, above the clouds, which were as high as the 9th heaven, a woman with fluttering clothes stood on the great Liang dragon sparrow and flew with the wind. Her whole body was bathed in golden light. She held a copper coin above her head and looked at it in a daze. She knew that he lied to her. She suddenly felt a little annoyed. She suddenly flew up on her sword and said angrily, "I should have found some copper coins." Chapter 1481. There were many brothels in Snow Lotus City, and they were clustered together. The tall buildings stretched as far as the eye could see, and the layers upon layers of overhanging eaves actually gave off a grandeur similar to that of an imperial palace. The Snow Lotus building was the one with the tallest eaves, and it had 8 floors. The name of the sleepless city also came from this. It was dawn, but the wide main street was not deserted. There were constantly rich men in disheveled clothes walking out of the brothels with enchanting women snuggling up to them. If they met their brother-in-law on the bed on the street, the men would look at each other and smile. Everything would be understood without words. Su Fengnian let the man of sacrifice from the whisk room lead the way. When he walked on the street full of the strong fragrance of cosmetics, there were many brothel girls who were tired and should have gone back to the building to catch up on sleep. They threw flirtatious glances at Su Fengnian. Some of the bolder girls even tried to seduce this handsome guy with a strange face. The street was very long. Su Fengnian walked forward with his saber hanging on his waist. Amidst the surprised cries, shouts, and laughter, there were many women who had just climbed into their beds but had not yet fallen asleep. Following the sounds and movements, they opened their windows and leaned against the railings, smiling as they watched this distinguished and elegant young master. Someone started shouting, "Young master, your servant will pay you 20 taels of silver. Do you want to come?" Very soon, there were people offering 30 taels of silver. The second-class spy from the whisk room, who was the only one other than Mrs. Song in the Snow Lotus building who knew about Su Fengnian's identity, broke out in a cold sweat. At the same time, he also had a heroic spirit. He thought that if the northern barbarians had a young empress, then Liang Mang wouldn't have to fight anymore. Su Fengnian dodged the messy things like fruits, silk scarves, and undergarments. He felt a little helpless. Only then did he remember that he hadn't been to a brothel since he parted with the girl who held the white cat, Wu Meinyang. Earlier, when he was hanging out with Li Han, Lin Yen, and the other martial arts addicts, he often saw this scene. However, at that time, the brothels in Liangzhou and Lingzhou all knew about his background. They were more interested in his Royal Highness title and the money in their pockets. Unlike other brothels, the Snow Lotus building was located on both sides of the street. It occupied the end of the street and stood out like a crane among chickens. It was like a king facing the north and facing the south. The unusual noise on the street also alarmed the Snow Lotus building. Therefore, when Su Fengnian walked out of the building, There were curious girls on the 6th floor and below sticking their heads out of the windows. However, the rules of the Snow Lotus building were strict. They didn't dare to join in the fun like their peers. Especially when they saw the burly man standing at the bottom of the stairs in a respectful manner, they didn't dare to act rashly. Su Fengnian didn't care about this harmless episode. Tuoba Bodhisattva of the 4 great grandmasters had already confirmed his return to the north. Dong Tai had never been an enemy. Chao Changqing was in Guangling Road. Who in the world could assassinate him? Who would dare? Madame Song didn't go downstairs to welcome him with great fanfare. Obviously, she was being cautious. Su Fengnian went straight to the top floor. Madame Song and the new courtesan of the Snow Lotus building, Yu Qingling, whom he had met not long ago, stood at the door of an elegant room. Madame Song pushed the door open. Su Fengnian stepped over the threshold and entered the quaint room. Madame Song and Yu Qingling quietly followed behind. The burly man quickly closed the door and stood outside the room like a door god. After Su Fengnian found a chair and sat down, Yu Qingling began to brew tea without Madame Song's instruction. The tea set on the table had already been prepared. Su Fengnian signaled Madame Song to sit down with him. She gently asked if he wanted to eat breakfast. Su Fengnian shook his head and asked, "Have you settled Xiao Mu and the 2 children?" Madame Song reported, "Everything has been settled. According to the order, the forces in the Snow Lotus building have begun to operate. They will be able to seize the Snow Lotus in Lu Huaishi's residence by tonight at the latest." Yu Qingling's smooth movements of brewing tea suddenly became sluggish. Madame Song's expression didn't change, but her eyes narrowed in an instant. Su Fengnian waved his hand and said, "Cancel the mission. There's no need for it." Madame Song nodded and didn't show any doubt. Su Fengnian said softly, "I'll rest in the Snow Lotus building for a day. You can carry on as usual. You don't have to spend time entertaining me." Madame Song wanted to say something but hesitated. Without waiting for Su Fengnian to speak, she immediately dismissed the idea and said with a guilty expression, "I've overstepped." Su Fengnian smiled and said, "There's nothing to hide. I just fought with Tuoba Bodhisattva, who chased me all the way to Snow Lotus City. We still couldn't determine the winner. I reckon Li Mibi is beating his chest and stamping his feet right now. Beimang paid a great price for this assassination." Yu Qingling felt as if she was struck by lightning. Beimang's military god, Tuoba Bodhisattva, and Li Mibi, the ancestor of spies, which one of them wasn't a terrifying figure? Su Fengnian said apologetically, "After I step into the Snow Lotus building, your identities will soon be discovered. Among the forces in Snow Lotus City, the only threat is Western Shu. But don't worry, Western Shu can't take care of itself in a short period of time. In addition, their spies have always been weak. Furthermore, I will also send a group of Fu Shui House's men of sacrifice here. If there's no accident, the leader will be called Fan Shaochai. If necessary, the Finger Xian Sword Grandmaster, Mi Fengjie, will also accompany her. Because Snow Lotus City cannot be abandoned for the time being, I need the Snow Lotus House, which has the innate advantage of being close to the water tower, to help keep an eye on the changes in the situation between Western Shu and Nanzhao. In the future, I may force you to go to Nanzhao and contact some people." Madame Song smiled and said, "It's Snow Lotus Building's great honor to be able to contribute to Mount Qing Liang and Fu Shui House. I won't refuse even if I have to die 10,000 times." From the corner of Yu Qingling's eyes, she could see that Madame Song was in high spirits and had a warm smile on her face. This was very different from the Madame Song in her memory. Ever since Yu Qingling settled down in the Snow Lotus House when she was young, the Madame Song in her memory had always been a serious and cold person. Even when facing the courtesans like Yu Qingling, she was always stingy with her smiles. This was the first time Yu Qingling knew that a Madame Song who smiled from the bottom of her heart was like a finishing touch. Soon, Yu Qingling calmed herself down and tidied up her chaotic emotions. She handed the young man a cup of sparrow tongue tea that was picked from the old tea tree on the top of Tianmu Peak in Nanzhao. Yu Qingling took advantage of the short time when he reached out to take the teacup and casually glanced at him. She was not stupid. If he was only treated with respect by Madame Song, then all the hidden leaders of the Fu Shui House in Beiliang were qualified. However, if it was a battle with Tuoba Bodhisattva, and there was a sense of victory and defeat, then the identity of the handsome man in front of her naturally came to light. In the entire Baoyang, there was only one person who was more powerful than Chu Lushan, the Fu Shui House's behind-the-scenes leader who was also the protector general of Baoyang. Prince Liang, Su Fengyan. Yu Qingling could not help but sigh. He was really young. Su Fengyan did not care about Yu Qingling's little thoughts. He leisurely drank tea while casually chatting with Madame Song about the local conditions and customs of Snow Lotus City. Moreover, he had been entangled with Tuoba Bodhisattva for more than half a month and was constantly on the verge of death. He also needed to learn about the situation of Liang Mang's battle and the changes in the world from the Snow Lotus House. However, the Snow Lotus House was located in a small city outside the Great Wall in the southwest border. Its geographical location could not be compared with the 8 houses in the Nanzhao Kingdom of Western Shu. The Snow Lotus House was only in the middle of the 72 houses inside and outside the Whispering House. However, Madame Song's identity was so special that even Chu Lushan had a whole new level of respect for her. In addition, Su Fengyan and Tuoba Bodhisattva had fought all the way from the northern part of the western regions to the southern part of the western regions. Therefore, the Whispering House sent some extra spies to the Snow Lotus House so that once Su Fengyan entered Snow Lotus City, he would be the first to receive the news. However, Su Fengyan only knew that Lu Gui's Huda City was still intact. The construction of the huge new city in the northern part of Liangzhou province, which was even larger than Huda City, was about to begin. In the area of Qingsong City in Liuzhou province, the Longxiang army and Lu Gui's army had a probing battle. Both sides suffered losses that were within the acceptable range. Furthermore, after Crouching Gong and Luanhe cities were breached by Beimang's vanguard general Zhong Tan, Xiaguang City also fell to Beimang's all-out offensive. The Tiger Pouncing Camp, which had been personally approved by the king of Baoyang and personally issued a military order in the name of the Baoyang Protectorate and Chu Lushan, had once made outstanding contributions to the Yuzhou infantry headquarters. From the main general, Sun Shu, to the 23 captains and 47 deputy captains, to all the soldiers, the 2,726 people in the camp had all died in battle. Yu Qingling didn't know why, but when she heard these concise words from Madame Song's mouth, she felt as if she could hear the sounds of battle drums, battle cries, smoke, corpses, faces covered in blood, and unsheathed Baoyang sabers. She didn't know when, but when tears streamed down her face, she saw the young vassal king leaning back in his chair and drinking tea. His face was expressionless and indifferent. Yu Qingling, this lowly chess piece of the Fu Shui chamber who had worked so hard to become a second-class concubine, suddenly couldn't help but feel angry. She suddenly felt a surge of courage. She stared straight at this young man who could, at times, openly wear a python robe. Her eyes were filled with doubt and resentment. The soldiers at the border were sacrificing their lives for you, for your Su family. Could it be that you couldn't show a bit of grief? Could it be that just because they were one of the 300,000 cavalrymen of Baoyang, they had to die as if it was right and proper? They couldn't even be bothered to make you frown. Madame Song said softly, "Since the battle between you and Liang provinces started, no one from the Baoyang frontier army has surrendered." Su Fengyan nodded and said, "Before Beimang's army enters the border, even if some of us are willing to surrender, Beimang won't accept it." Yu Qingling was supposed to pour tea for him and refill his cup, but she put down the teapot heavily to vent her anger. Then she smiled bitterly. With the mentality of death, she wanted to ask this young vassal king whether he had a heart or not. Chapter 1482. But before Yu Qingling could open her mouth, Madame Song, who was very experienced in observing people's expressions, said sternly, "Shut up. Yu Qingling, get out." Yu Qingling stood up absent-mindedly and left the room in a daze. Madame Song smiled bitterly and said, "Prince, Yu Qingling is just a child. She has lived her whole life in Snow Lotus City without any wind or rain. She doesn't know anything. Please don't blame her." Su Fengyan bent down and picked up the teapot. He poured a cup of tea for himself and also poured a cup for Madame Song. He shook his head and said, "It's fine." Madame Song said softly, Snow Lotus Building is a Mandarin duck building with two buildings connected by a corridor in the sky. That's why it has the reputation of pavilion in the sky. The front building is mainly used for banquets and tea. Guests usually come in at night and leave in the morning. The back building is used for accommodation. Most of the guests who are familiar with Snow Lotus Building can enter. It's just that this servant doesn't know if Prince wants to live in the back building or find a quiet house nearby to rest. It's not far, it only takes half a cup of tea's time. Su Fengnian smiled and said, "It's not too troublesome. I'll just live in the back building." Madame Song was a bit hesitant. The back building had a first-class room that was not inferior to a marquis's house. However, Snow Lotus Building was filled with people from all over the world. There were many rich people who spent a lot of money to stay in this gentle place. Often, they would stay for 10 days to half a month. Dirty things often happened in this place. What Madame Song meant was that she hoped that the young prince could choose a quiet courtyard in the noisy place. Otherwise, it would be inappropriate for the dignified king of Bailiang to live on the same floor with those men. However, since he said so, Madame Song didn't add more feet to the snake. She led Su Fengnian down to the 6th floor and walked through the unique corridor. When they arrived at the back building, Madame Song didn't ask the women in Snow Lotus Building to prepare the clothes he needed to change into after bathing. She did everything herself, even pouring water into the bathtub in the room. As for the matter of volunteering herself to sleep with him, Madame Song didn't dare to expect it, nor would she think about it. In the brothels of the world, no matter how beautiful you are, no matter how many men you have under your skirt, aren't they all mediocre? Growing out of the mud without being stained? Did she really think that she was a female bodhisattva sitting on a lotus platform? Su Fengnian, dressed in rags, walked Madame Song to the door. He took off the cold knife, took a bath, changed his clothes, shaved his beard, and trimmed his nails. Finally, he felt refreshed. And then he sat down in front of the table. His mind stirred slightly. The remnants of the flying swords that Dong Tai gave him years ago flew out of his sleeve and floated about a foot away from the table. Black armor, childhood sweetheart, morning dew, spring water, peach blossom, moth may, vermilion bird, huang tong swan, golden thread tail. At first, there were a total of 12 flying swords, each containing 12 different sword forms. The sword forms were already clear in his heart, but after several great battles, there were only 4 flying swords left. Childhood sweetheart Huang Tong Swan. People often say that things remain the same, but people change. However, on Su Fengnian's side, it was people who relied on old things that gradually disappeared. Su Fengnian did not put away the 4 flying swords that depended on each other. He let them rest quietly on the table, closed his eyes, and began to breathe. The reason why Taoists were proficient in the art of breathing and advocated returning to simplicity was because there was a saying that when a newborn baby fell to the ground, it would spit out the turbid qi from his previous life. Young children often cried because they did not hide the turbid qi in their abdomen. They did not know the art of breathing and nourishing their body, but their zhenqi naturally existed for a long time. Therefore, it fit the word naive. When a person grew up, although he learned to endure things silently and liked to praise someone's maturity by not showing his joy, in the eyes of Taoists, it was contrary to his nature. Su Fengnian was half asleep and half awake. He was in a trance. He breathed in and out, and his mind was retracted and released. At this moment, he could hear many movements inside and outside the Snow Lotus Tower. The next moment, it was as if the world was completely silent. Su Fengnian thought of the blind old soldier, Su Yongguan from the fish drum camp, who sent him off 600 times on his way to the capital post. He thought of the Yuzhou cavalry who fought from Ji Bay to the mouth of the calabash. He thought of many people and many things. After an unknown period of time, Su Fengnian was awakened by the sound of light footsteps outside the door. He suddenly realized that the lanterns outside the window were already lit. Su Fengnian put away his flying sword and walked to the window, lost in thought. After this battle, Su Fengnian was confident that it would not take long before he could fight Tuoba Bodhisattva to a draw. He would also be able to compete with Dong Tai, who had the strongest killing power among the 4 grandmasters. As for Chao Changqing, who was considered to be the most famous among the four grandmasters, but was only considered to be the last among the four grandmasters. After all, Tuoba Bodhisattva was publicly recognized as the number 2 who would only lose to Wang Xianxia. Dong Tai had also improved after Li Chungang lent him his sword and went to the sea to visit the immortals. Su Fengnian used the momentum of defeating Wang Xianxia in one move, and his reputation in Jianghu was like the sun in the sky. Only Chao Changqing had not fought with a grandmaster of the same cultivation level for many years. Even though he appeared briefly with Ginger in Great Pea City, he did not fight. He only fought with Gu Jianteng, Lu Hao, and the others. There was no real life and death battle. Therefore, compared to Su Fengnian, Dong Tai, and Tuoba Bodhisattva, it was inevitable that he would be looked down upon. However, Su Fengnian was well aware that after Confucian sage Chao Changqing changed his mind, not only was his cultivation base the highest among the four, he was also the one with the strongest battle prowess. At this time, Chao Changqing might not be inferior to himself when his celestial being physique was at its peak. Outside the room, Madame Song brought along the elite men of sacrifice of the whisk chamber whose names Su Fengnian still didn't know. She gently knocked on the door. After getting permission, Madame Song pushed the door open and said, "Lu Huaishi came to visit Snow Lotus House alone. I didn't dare to make a decision on my own, so I had to disturb Prince's rest." Su Fengnian smiled and said, "Let's go and meet him together. I'm also very curious about this legendary figure who ruled over a region. Madame Song, when the time comes, just tell him that I'm the new guard of Snow Lotus House." Madame Song smiled faintly and endured. Su Fengnian joked, Indeed. Even if Snow Lotus House is rich and overbearing, it doesn't seem like they can afford to hire a hired thug like me." The three of them walked together in the corridor that was covered with Western Shu's gorgeous silk. After turning a corner, they passed by a room. Coincidentally, a guest opened the door and a group of people filed out. There were 4 men and 1 woman. The woman wore a purple dress with a purple scabbard and a delicate purple bamboo flute hanging from her waist. The woman was beautiful, but her face was cold and distant. The other 3 young men had different styles. The leader had a lively personality and a delicate face. He jumped out of the door with his hands crossed behind his back. He was talking to a tall man with sword-like eyebrows with a smile. The other person had the demeanor of a noble family. He had a jade-like face and was dressed luxuriously. He was whispering to an old man with graying temples who carried a sword on his back. The 2 groups of people bumped into each other. In fact, each side took a step back and brushed past each other lightly. However, the men of sacrifice who led the way for Su Fengnian and Madame Song did not intend to stop. As for the young master, who went out first, he was probably used to being spoiled by the elders at home, so he did not have a good temper. He blocked the way in the middle of the corridor, shook his shoulders, and squinted his eyes and laughed. Madame Song frowned slightly. Su Fengnian shook his head without batting an eyelid. Madame Song understood tacitly and said to the top master of Snow Lotus House who wanted to barge through, "Meng Li, forget it." Chapter 1483. Hearing Meng Li's name, only the old man with the sword on his back twitched his eyelids. Other than him who was experienced in Jianghu, it was the first time for the others to enter Snow Lotus City. Although the juniors around him were not unscrupulous disciples who did not know the immensity of heaven and earth, the purple-clothed woman and the pair of siblings were from sects and clans that were outstanding in the southwest province. As for the tall young man with no foundation, he was also a rare rising star. They looked down on this small border city from the bottom of their hearts. However, the old man had heard of Meng Li before. He rarely fought in Snow Lotus City, but it was said that he had a death battle with a few experts under Lu Huaishi. Most of the latter disappeared from Jianghu, and Lu Huaishi was recognized as a second-level master. Since Meng Li was still alive, it meant that either the Snow Lotus House was not to be trifled with, or Meng Li had the ability to challenge Lu Huaishi. The old man believed that he had reached a higher level in Jianghu, so even if he was not afraid of Meng Li, he still had to be cautious when facing such a local tyrant. It was better to avoid trouble. Just as the old man was about to take a step back to avoid trouble, the young woman who was dressed as a man clicked her tongue and said, "Forget it? What a big tone. Or you. If you don't forget it, what else do you want? The purple-clothed woman, who had arrived at Snow Lotus City earlier than her companions, sighed softly. She then said to the disciple of a noble family who looked somewhat similar to the young girl, "That woman is the headmistress of the Snow Lotus House." The young man nodded. He was born in a prestigious family and did not have any intention of causing trouble. He smiled at the arrogant girl and said, "Damn girl, come back." The young woman was unwilling, but she was no longer aggressive. However, someone quickly added fuel to the fire. The eyes of the tall young man, who exuded an aura of savagery, burned with passion as he stared fixedly at Madame Song, whose skin was still as charming as that of a young girl's. "You're Madame Song from Snow Lotus City, the woman who even the deputy general of Yi Province in the Western Shu Empire couldn't win over?" He grinned, revealing his white teeth. "Mrs. Song, my name is Zhang Wuho. I'm the guy who peed in front of the Zhao family's mansion. I've admired you for a long time." Mrs. Song didn't get angry because of the young man's frivolous words. She smiled and said, "I know." The young girl was clearly very dissatisfied with the man beside her who was fickle-minded. She coldly snorted and looked at Madame Song with even more provocation. "Zhang Wuho, what are you admiring? She's old enough to be your mother." Marquis Zhang Wuho, whose name had shaken the southwest of Liang because of his unbridled behavior, smiled and said, "This little girl doesn't understand Madame Song's kindness." The old man with the sword on his back was deeply worried. That elegant young man was also helpless. However, it would be a big joke to say that he was afraid of offending the entire Snow Lotus City. Su Fengnian didn't expect these people to be so bold. He didn't want them to continue insulting Madame Song, so he smiled and said, "When you're outside, you should speak properly. At the very least, you should speak human language." Then, Su Fengnian turned to look at Madame Song. "Don't tell me that everyone wants to carve the words 'come and hit me' on their faces when they walk the streets nowadays? I didn't have this courage back then." Madame Song smiled and said, "These people are probably either the disciples of Wang Xianji, Chao Chongqing, or the sons and daughters of the feudal princes and princesses of Liang. That's why they're so bold." Su Fengnian laughed and said, "Even if that's the case, it still doesn't make sense." Madame Song, who seemed to be speaking in riddles with Su Fengnian, nodded and deliberately said with a look of realization, "Oh right, it still doesn't make sense." The young girl was furious and said angrily, "Shameless adulterers. Don't even think about leaving here today. I don't care if you're Madame Song or not. You're still a prostitute and an old one at that." Madame Song was completely indifferent. She had used a short span of 12 years to turn the Snow Lotus House into the largest brothel in the southern part of the western regions. Even Lu Huaishi had no choice but to tolerate this thorn in his side. How could she be defeated by a little girl with a few words? If it weren't for the king of Bailiang by her side, she would have been able to easily leave a psychological shadow in the young girl's heart for the rest of her life. As a death warrior trained by the whisk room, Meng Li attached great importance to the rules. As long as Madame Song didn't say anything, he wouldn't do anything even if he had a strong killing intent. However, a sinister smile had already appeared on his face. Su Fengnian smiled and said, "That's enough." The young girl sneered and said, "You're just a pretty boy raised by an old woman. Who do you think you are? You think you're qualified to talk to me?" Zhang Wuho was originally a daring person, and he also had an astonishing backing. He chuckled and said, "You're not convinced? Why don't we spar? If you win, we'll make way. If you lose, Madame Song will be mine. How about it?" Su Fengnian smiled and said, "Spar? Sure." After saying that, he slowly walked forward. Meng Li quickly took the initiative to retreat and make room. His eyes were blazing with madness, and even his hands and feet couldn't help but tremble. He was one of the 4 grandmasters of the world. How many people could see the 4 of them in action? In the blink of an eye, the young girl didn't even notice anything strange. Then, a deafening sound came from behind her. She then discovered that Zhang Wuho had turned into that passable-looking young man who had the most repulsive smile. It turned out that Zhang Wuho had been pushed out by Su Fengnian's palm on his forehead. He crashed through the wall, passed through the room, and broke through the wall again. Just like that, he fell out of the 8th floor of the Snow Lotus Tower. Among the group, the old man with the sword on his back had the highest cultivation. However, he didn't see how this young man with an ordinary aura attacked. The old man instinctively reached out to pull out his sword. Su Fengnian only stood beside the young girl and looked at the 2 eye-catching holes. He waited patiently for a long time before turning his head and looking at the shocked Grandmaster of the Southwest. He asked with a smile, "What's wrong? You can't even pull out your sword?" At this time, everyone discovered that the Grandmaster of the Sword, who was unreachable in their hearts, had reached out to grab the hilt of the sword on his back. The sword, which weighed no more than a few kilograms, seemed to be as heavy as a mountain. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't move it in the slightest. This scene was too ridiculous and comical. This accidental disturbance seemed to be an ordinary quarrel, but in reality, everyone in the group had their own schemes. Not to mention the pitiful person who had already fallen out of the Snow Lotus Tower, the girl in purple wanted to borrow the power of the Southwest Jianghu to make a name for herself. For a heroine to walk the Jianghu, winning the title of fairy, was only the first step. She still needed a variety of methods to manage it. She needed to climb up to a towering tree so that she could intimidate others. She needed to be on good terms with the seniors, carefully win over young masters who had money and family background, and so on. On the road of Western Shu, the awe-inspiring son of an aristocratic family had sharp eyes. He had seen the old-style cold saber on Su Fengnian's waist. His family had suffered a lot at the hands of the Su family, so they wanted to skin the Bailiang Su family alive. As for the dandy sons of Western Shu who liked to wear cold sabers, he had personally killed and crippled many of them over the years due to his anger. Now that he had met such a person in Snow Lotus City, other than disliking him, he wanted to test the waters. He wanted to create a farce and reveal some of the old secrets of the Snow Lotus Tower. If she really had an affair with Bailiang, then he would have a merit that he could easily obtain. As for the girl who was angry at Zhang Wuho's fickleness, how could his eyes not light up?